This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Can I ask everyone to please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? And can I now ask Paul Goodchild, our clerk, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence today from Assembly Member Desai, and Assembly Member Cooper will be joining us shortly as substitute. Also apologies from Assembly Member Fortune, and Assembly Member Boff will be joining us shortly as substitute. And Assembly Member Pigeon is joining us online today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Noted. Excellent. So that brings us to our main item of business this morning, which is discussion focusing on the Greater London Authority 2024-25 group budget, for which we are joined by a panel of guests this morning. Welcome, everyone. We have Sadiq Khan, who's the Mayor of London. Morning, Sadiq. We have David Bellamy, who's the Mayor's Chief of Staff. Morning, David. We're also joined by Enver, who's the Interim Chief Finance Officer of the Greater London Authority. Morning, Enver. And also Elliot Ball, who is the Assistant Director of Finance and Governance of the Greater London Authority. Morning, Elliot. So if I will kick off. Obviously, we've had a bit of news, I suppose. Obviously, our purpose here this morning is to look at what's going on in terms of the process of setting the budget. I suppose the first question is about what choices and pressures have been on the budget and what choices you've made to address those pressures. So, Sadiq, if you'd like to give us your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Chair. Can I begin by wishing all of you a very happy New Year?
Yes, of course. Happy New Year to you.
So, I mean, the challenge we have every year, and it's been no different this year, is frankly speaking, Chair, the time has been a challenge. Just to remind colleagues, we're required to publish our draft consultation budget by the 19th of December. We got in the days preceding that the police settlement on the 14th, the local government and fire settlement on the 18th, and on the day we were due to publish and did publish draft consultation budget, the announcement from the government about the TfL capital grant. So those were the things we were grappling with. For example, if it was the case that we received half in the end, we didn't receive any, what sort of things we have to do. So those are the sorts of things taking place in the days and weeks preceding publication of the draft consultation budget. You'll appreciate, because of the date of publication, then Christmas and the New Year arrive in, we've had little time to decide how monies are allocated. You alluded to the announcement today in relation to the extension by a further year of universal free school meals. Over the course of the coming days and weeks, in response to, I'm sure, the consultation, but meetings with colleagues in City Hall will be deciding how the rest of any net money is allocated.
Okay, well, I suppose we've had a couple of announcements in the last few days. Obviously, there was three, really. So we had news overnight of the non-domestic rates allocation, or part of it, which is a net, I believe, of 228 million. We've had an announcement this morning about free school meals, which you've just mentioned, and also, of course, there was the announcement over the weekend about possibly £30 million for the RNT to avert the strike action this week. In terms of the £30 million, was it actually £30 million? That's a figure in the press. I don't know if you can confirm to us that it was £30 million.
No, I mean, I don't want to talk about figures in the press, but it's important that we allow discussions to take place, but we shouldn't believe what's in the press.
Well, I definitely believe that the strike action hasn't happened, and I don't think RMT would have just abandoned that at the 11th hour for no reason. So, the reports of extra money,
that's quite
I
clear.
shouldn't believe any of that.
I've said in the first person, no, there is extra money in relation to money from City Hall as opposed to TfL. TfL are quite clear, and they were accurate in the conversations they'd had with all the trade unions. They simply had no more room to manoeuvre. Over the course of the weekend, bearing in mind the impact on our economy, I think just the hospitality sector, all the other sectors, estimate a loss of £50 million. The timing was fortuitous because obviously we're in the budget setting process with the 17th of January as the date by which we're going to publish the draft budget, and so I did say to colleagues, we've got monies in at this time of year, and let's use some of that to see if we can suspend the strike action, call the strikes off, and work with all four trade unions to resolve this amicably.
So it's GLA money, not TfL money, that's the extra money that's into that equation?
Correct.
And how much GLA money?
I'm not going to say that publicly, but the figure you've said that's in the media is not a figure I would say is the figure.
So not 30 million, but some other number, presumably a significant amount, because RMT abandoned the strikes very, very late on, which would not have been an easy decision for them.
The important thing for RMT to know is that there's additional money that City Hall has given TfL to enable further discussions to take place.
Okay, and presumably you anticipate other unions asking for more money as well. Is there more money in the pot if anyone else comes forward?
I think it's a question of equity. You should ensure that all workers, if there's additional money, get that support, and that will be part of the conversations that I had with the trade unions.
So it sounds like the bat signal's gone up from City Hall that if you want more money, threaten a strike.
I think let's be quite clear in relation to the importance of ensuring that you talk to colleagues who may have concerns. I believe in talking negotiations. I don't see it as a sign of weakness. I see it as a sign of recognising the fantastic work our transport workers do, represented by excellent trade unions, and I'm keen to make sure we resolve things amicably.
Well, sure, but it's not talking that's called off the strikes, it's extra money. And obviously there'll be further rounds of extra money, presumably, because apart from anything else, that's a baseline for any future negotiation, isn't it? That will be an increment from there next year or the year after or the year after.
So, Chair,
I'm sorry, David, my question was to the Mayor.
There's precedents in the past where we've supported colleagues to avoid strike action and to resolve disputes. Over the course of the last year, the fire service was supported by City Hall. The GLA, indeed, was supported as a consequence of interventions I made. The government themselves gave additional money through the Home Office to the police. So there's something new about recognising the importance of supporting negotiations, reaching an amicable solution. And I look across our city, listening to businesses and hospitality, speaking to patients who can now go to appointments at hospital. Children go to school and college. The only people unhappy are the Tories about these strikes,
so
which I find astonishing.
So it's okay. It's positive news that the strikes aren't happening, but you won't confirm how much extra money has made that. Is it more than 30 or less than 30?
I'm not going to go into figures.
So you won't say if it's. You say it's not 30, but you won't say if it's higher or lower than 30.
I'm not going into figures.
Okay. In terms of the consultation budget, which is obviously where we are now in this formal process, do you consult London councils as part of this is you setting your precept onto the council tax that they collect? So what's your process of consulting with boroughs about what that would be, how much it would be?
Yeah, we do. I'll bring in Enver and David to explain the conversations we have with them. You'll appreciate, Chair, that actually we don't actually know the amount of monies that the councils collect until quite later on. But all 33 councils are spoken to and consulted, and Enver and David can explain the process by which we do that.
Yeah, morning, Chair. We are here because the Mayor is consulting the Assembly on his consultation budget, and just in the same way as that's a consultation to the Assembly, he also consults with the 33 local authorities in London and other groups as well, and so they're obviously very welcome to feedback their views in that consultation.
Okay, and I suppose my final question is, when we go from here to the next stage, which is your final budget, what changes are you anticipating there might be between now and then?
Well, it depends on the responses, clearly, to the consultation. As David has said, it's a consultation. The challenge we have, Chair, and it's one we have every year, and you're used to this as a member of the Assembly, is the timelines. And so we published the draft budget on the 17th, and then you'll be aware of the publication of the final budget in February. Clearly, the sooner people put in their views and ideas, the sooner they can be taken on board with the draft budget. But we take on board representations made by, could be colleagues in the Assembly, could be London councils, it could be members of the public, could be businesses, and we'll go through the process. I'm afraid it's quite a short window, a narrow window, which you'll appreciate. And I know colleagues expressed concern about that in the past, and we'll do what we can.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question from Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you, Chair. I'm quite interested in in the question around council tax and the council tax setting process as well, because obviously there's a question about whether you consult with other councils, but just looking the other way around, because you've in the past, Mayor, called council tax a regressive tax, and councils across London are currently consulting on their budgets as well. And if you look at several London boroughs such as Bexley, Bromley, Harrow, Hillingdon, they're all proposing a council tax rise of 4.99%, which is obviously to the maximum threshold before you have to seek the public's permission to raise council tax by more. Have those councils spoken to the GLA before making, or do they speak to GLA before making their decisions as well? Because obviously the impact in the mayoral precept and the council tax increase impacts the same residents.
Yeah, no, they don't, but I don't criticise councils for having to go to the maximum they're allowed to go before they have a referendum. I think the government expects, and for the last few years has expected, because they've shunted the costs to council tax payers for providing essential public services, and so that's where you'll see it across London, across the country. You'll see councils going to the maximum they're allowed to do. But the short answer to your question is, they don't consult us. But one of the advantages of us announcing our draft as early as we do is they're aware of our draft suggestion in relation to police precept, non-police precept, and the TfL precept. But I think we should all recognise the huge pressures councils are under of all political parties over the last 14 years across the country.
Thank you. So we now move on to a section about TfL fares and financial sustainability with Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd just like to pick up from actually your opening questions about the additional money that's been found, which has stopped the strikes, which is really welcome. What I just want to clarify is, which fund has it come from at the GLA? Obviously, I'm not asking about the amount of money. You've made your position clear there, but where has it come from? Is it from the borrowing facility that you have for TfL? Has it come from a reserve? Could you clarify that, please?
Dear Assembly Member, it's going to come from the additional funds that are available as set out following the provisional settlement and the difference between the provisional settlement and the prudent assumptions we made in the Mayor's budget guidance.
So it's coming out of the information we had last night, which you've also taken out the free school meals, yes?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. I just wanted to get that clarified for us. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Mayor, about fares. We know that I still can't get my head around that March rather than January is when the new fare rises come in. But I'm wondering, can you talk us through when you think you'll be making a final decision around your fares for the next year, what you are considering as part of that, and whether you're looking at dynamic fare pricing, something we've talked about before?
Thanks for your question, and thanks for your just goes back to a question the chair asked about taking on board suggestions and consultation and stuff. And you in the past have made some pretty good suggestions, which some have been taken on board, and Londoners are benefiting from. So you're right. We now decide the fares much later than we did in the past by a number of weeks. Working backwards, Caroline, we've got to make sure that any increase goes live the same day as the national increases, which there's a date in March. I forget the exact date in March. So working backwards, I think we've got 6 weeks in advance of that to get the systems to go. So in the next few weeks, I'll be making the decision final, and I've already had meetings with TfL in relation to the options that you allude to. What is possible? You'll appreciate from your long service that actually in London we are able to use the pay-as-you-go to play around with the caps and so forth and so forth. So you'll be hearing over the course of the next few weeks what I've decided to do in relation to that. But also just to remind colleagues, the national fare increase has been announced as 4.9% increase. Bus fares across the country have been frozen though at £2. In London, our bus fares are £1.75, and we have the hopper fare as well. And so we already have the cheapest bus fares in the country. We can also, not just in relation to the metrics you talk about, we can also look at buses differently to tube and so forth. So we've got more options than previous years.
So is your working assumption the 4.9% increase that we're seeing for National Rail, and then you may flex it so potentially the tube could be slightly higher but buses lower?
The business plan we published, Caroline, had an assumption of 4%. We published it a number of months ago as part of the funding agreement with the government. That's the assumption. You'll be aware where inflation has been, where inflation is, but also you'll be aware in relation to, I say this in general terms, more poorer Londoners use buses versus tube and so forth. So we're looking at everything. But what I've done in the past is not try and have a one-size-fits-all approach in relation to fares. There's a separate conversation which you've addressed in the past about peak, off-peak and so forth, what you can do. Those are also some things we're looking into.
Are you likely to bring some sort of dynamic fare pricing in this year, or is that something that's longer term?
Those are some of the options TfL are looking into. I've not made a decision in relation to what's doable in the short period of time we've got. But also you'll be aware about travel patterns post-pandemic. Roughly speaking, generalising, roughly speaking, 90% plus people back on the underground Monday to Thursday. Buses are now north of 5 million journeys again on a daily basis, and so we're getting numbers back. But you're right to look into the question of times of day, parts of London and so forth.
Good. Well, we look forward to seeing that. I presume the decision will be this month, if trying to work back from the date in March. So we should hear that from you in the next couple of weeks. Can I also ask you about TfL's financial sustainability?
Yep.
Because obviously that was one of the conditions from government, and government use a clear definition that it also, their view of financial sustainability includes capital enhancements and renewals, which seems to be slightly different to the definition that TfL has used. So I'm wondering whether you can confirm if TfL will be financially sustainable from the end of March.
Well, newsflash, government moves goalposts is the obvious starting point in relation to this. So look, just to remind colleagues, Caroline, you'll know this, but TfL's never been financially sustainable since it was set up in 2000. Since 2016, we've managed to reduce year-on-year like-for-like operating costs. We had a deficit of more than £700 million when I became mayor. Each year it was going down, and we were on target to go into surplus by 21. Then the pandemic happened in March 2020. We're on course to be in surplus operating costs in the next couple of months. And we're also, in terms of capital costs, enhancement/renewals, the budget was, I think, £1.9 billion. We asked the government for a quarter of that, 25% roughly speaking. They gave half of that, 12.5%. The good news is, with the definition we've always used, but also with the government definition, we should be financially sustainable in the near future.
Okay, but looking at your capital plan and the budget, my understanding is there's a 71 million potential shortfall around enhancements and renewals. Do you think that you are going to be able to plug that gap? Are you confident of that?
So remember, sorry, that's not a number I recognise.
Okay.
So TfL looks. First question, is TfL operationally sustainable? Answer: yes. It's forecast to deliver £144 million operating surplus this year. That includes financing costs, and that includes capital renewal costs. And that operating surplus is forecast to grow across the course of the business plan up to £450 million surplus in 26-27. And this surplus is really important because what that is used for is to enable the investment in capital enhancements. And what my understanding is of what DfT are saying is they're saying, look, we understand you can't pay entirely for major schemes like new trains, new signalling, major road schemes, and you need some help with that. And obviously we saw the capital funding settlement just before Christmas that the Mayor referred to earlier. But otherwise, you're on your own, don't expect help from us. And so that's exactly what this budget and TfL's business plan does. It delivers an operating surplus in order to fund capital enhancements. Now, we might all like more capital enhancements in the network, but absolutely the business plan and the budget match up to the funding that is available in terms of what actually can be delivered. So in that sense, absolutely it is sustainable.
Good. So you're confident you've got a sustainable budget and you can provide a safe transport service for Londoners?
Yes, Cara, but there's a really important caveat, and I think that's what David was alluding to, is our ambitions are less than they otherwise would be. This goes to the point I made at last MQTs about we would like a capital budget more than £2 billion, but we've had to restrict that, if you like, is our plan B. Plan A was bigger, but plan B smaller. So safe, yes. But the other example, which I know is personal to you, is, for example, major road junctions around cycle safety and so forth. We'd want to do far more, far quicker, which we can't do because of the limitations in relation to the capital budget as is, as opposed to as it should be.
So it's only sustainable because you're slowing down what you're able to deliver within the year.
Spot on.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman Pigeon. Actually, just on that point, sorry, Mr. Mayor, you said that the money, in answer to Caroline Pigeon, you said that the money for to avert the strike was from the business rates money, which we learned about on Monday evening, but the announcement was made on Sunday. So what was the timeline of that then?
Well, the timeline was obviously the provisional settlements were on the 18th of December. Enver and Elliott and team spent that week working to understand them. We came back in the new year, and obviously I was thus able to have an initial discussion with the Mayor about possibilities. About
so the information that we were given yesterday as members of this committee about the business rates, you learnt about that on the 18th of December?
No, the government published the provisional settlement.
I'm sorry, it's just that we're very pressed for time, and I don't want the brief history of the world.
That's fine.
Business
I'm trying
rates
to answer your
information.
question very directly.
Good.
The government published the provisional settlements on the 18th of December. Officers then had to analyse them. then the Mayor was briefed about their contents on the 3rd of January.
The word business rates didn't appear in your answer to my question about business rates. So when did the Mayor know about the business rates? And I don't know why he's not answering, he's sitting next to you.
It's part of the provisional settlement.
So the figure that the figure that we on this committee learnt about yesterday, the Mayor knew that when?
3rd of January.
And the announcement about the strikes was made on Sunday. So the information that he had, okay. So what was the reason why we on this committee did not learn about it until so recently? Whose decision was that? Enver.
I wanted to give you a position that was for all of the changes of the settlements, and the bit that we were struggling with was the police bit. And really, until we listened to them yesterday in that committee in the afternoon, we were still wondering what is the actual adverse impact of the government grant. It's not business rates, because it's a different source. So the Home Office grant was adverse, but the number kept changing as to how big the adverse variance was. So I wanted to make sure that what MOPAC said to you yesterday was consistent with what I was going to say to you as the total position, and that was the number that was fluctuating. So we were almost there, but I needed to know the exact number, so we waited till what they announced yesterday to you.
Okay. So the short answer then is that you already knew about that money when you announced it, and so when the announcement was made on Sunday, you already knew about that money. That makes sense. Okay, Assembly Member Boff. Question? No?
I think you already dealt with it.
Okay, in that case...
But if I just want to clarify that figure that we talked about earlier. Okay.
I had you down as a supplementary.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you'd kind of asked it. But you said to us that there is, that you won't tell us what the amount of money is that you've agreed with the RMT for settling the pay dispute. Is that correct?
What I don't want to do is get into discussions about the negotiations with the RMT and how much money potentially is available, hypothetically speaking, in relation to RMT or other trade unions.
What is the figure that you have settled on to resolve the dispute?
No, there's no figure settled on, because there's a discussion and a negotiation, then you settle on a figure.
Right, and when will we know what that ultimate figure is?
When negotiations have ended.
Right. And have you budgeted for any future pay awards of a similar nature within your budget?
Yeah, one of the things, that's a really important point, one of the things in relation to things around wages is they're recurring. And that's why it's really important to be cognizant of the dangers of using one-off potential payments to recruit staff on permanent contracts or as a pay award. And those are some of the calculations internally that need to be done before we come up with a figure that can be used for recurring costs, like, for example, a pay increase.
And the other point, Assembly Member, is that this relates to the 23-24 pay settlement, and we know that 23-24 is a genuinely exceptional year because of the really high levels of inflation, and that's why, as the Mayor said earlier, he had to step in and provide extra funding for the fire brigade, City Hall. The Home Office had to step in around police pay, and so 23-24 very much an exceptional year.
Well, it's my experience that every year is an exceptional year, but thank you.
Yes, that's my experience. And of course, the thing about inflation is it compounds. So I think the point about one year having exceptionally high inflation doesn't detract from the point the Mayor was making about one-offs versus continuous money. In any case, I can't see any other indications on this topic, so we will move on to the next topic, which is the Met Police budget. So yesterday they were here, I'm sure you tuned in, as was the whole nation, and we had a discussion about this Annex 1 versus Annex 2 business, whereby they effectively provided us with two budgets, which I would interpret as the budget that you were willing to fund, and another budget which they would quite like, which was about another £140 million extra. So in terms of, I'm not aware of any other part of the GLA doing this year or previous years. So from your point of view, Mr. Mayor, was that a helpful thing for the Met to do, to give you a sort of a base budget and then a wish list, or was that unhelpful? And would you welcome other bits of the GLA doing that?
I mean, I think it's for the purpose of transparency. MOPO, we're keen, I suspect, for you and for everyone to see what the Met Police submission was to MOPAC. And I think to give the Commissioner credit, and I always like to do so, he wants to be transparent about what needs he has and the shortcomings there are in relation to funding. So, I mean, those are the conversations we'd have internally anyway, and so it gives you a chance to see some of the challenges there are. I mean, you're right to allude to the point that, of course, every functional body has an inverted commas wish list, which you can never fully realise, and so you make the point. Actually, we could do the same for every functional body and DC, and we could, but I think without wishing to get drawn into exceptional years, I think it may not be a bad thing in this particular circumstance for MOPEC to have done so. It's for you to decide whether it's helpful or not, really, rather than me.
Okay, so the 140 million, roughly, that is the gap between those two. Effectively, what's agreed or what's sort of provisionally agreed to be funded and what is currently unfunded. That largely amounts to accelerating and driving forward the Met Reform Plan, which obviously is an important part of your political programme as well. So I guess it's on your wish list as well as theirs. Where does that £140 million sit in terms of getting some money?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've also sought to do with the Commissioner, and it's not a secret, so I'm not breaching confidences, is lobby the government in relation to what we call NIC, the National International Capital Cities grant money, which we know in 2016 figures was 159 million shortfall. In what you're taking kind of inflation is circa 240 million pounds. So there's obviously an issue there in relation to our ability to lobby the government for more support. There's a separate conversation in relation to being fully transparent about where there are gaps in our budget in relation to things like special grant. You'll be aware, because it's been well rehearsed, about the cost of protests since October the 7th, £21 million, and that's on top of the £20 million for Just of All. So there's a discussion about special grant we're having with the government as well. There's also a conversation in relation to inflationary pressures, and on top of that, growth. And so you're right, one of my priorities is transforming the Met Police Service, which is what some of the detail of the £140 million is about. And we'll try and do what we can over the course of the next few days and weeks to try and prioritise those things that we can afford to fund. And I'm afraid some things that the Commissioner would like to do, we simply won't be able to do.
I mean, we spent quite a bit of time on this yesterday. I don't intend to spend so much time on it today, getting to the bottom of this Annex 1, Annex 2 business. But I think the long and the short of it was that if they don't get the extra money, then the reform programme in terms of 1,000 extra police staff and in terms of the new Met for London reform plan would have to be significantly decelerated, stretched out, other things deprioritised and so on. I mean, you talk about not having the money. Obviously, you could have had the money, but you chose to spend it on something else. So how do you weigh up in your mind £140 million to drive forward the Met Reform Plan versus a very similar amount of money you've announced today for free school meals? How do you weigh those up in your mind?
Well, we know that the government's taken back the money we would have received with the police uplift. And one of the conversations the Commissioner and his team have had with the Home Office is to try and use some of that money to employ civilian staff, which allows more officers to be frontline officers, bobbies on the beat, rather than doing, inverted commas, paperwork in the office and other stuff that can be done by civilians. And so those conversations are taking place with the Home Office in relation to more civilian staff. I've been quite clear in relation to where I can prioritise in the police service, so I'm incredibly proud in relation to money that I've got increasing by more than 80%, money City Hall gives to the Met Police Service since 2016, including, by the way, using business rates money, which is one of the sources of money for the free school meal. So we're doing what we can to support both, ensuring our city is safe, but also addressing the cost of living crisis.
Well, the Met are saying that they want an extra they need an extra £140 million to do the reform and the work that they want to do. And obviously, you're going to blame the government. I don't particularly criticise you for that. That's your standard position on everything. But you made a decision yesterday or today. You made an announcement today of very nearly £140 million for free school meals. That was money that you could have allocated at will to anything at all that was within your power. You chose to allocate it to that. You chose not to allocate it to the Met to do the things that you've just described that you would like to do. So how in your mind do you weigh up doing one of those versus the other? Because you could have done either, couldn't you?
Yes and no. So it goes back to an issue raised with Assembly Member Boff about recurring costs. So in February I announced £53 million of recurring money to the Met Police Service, £53.2 million of additional money to the police service. A lot of that £53 million recurring is around transformation, Leadership Academy and so forth. In fact, we are now funding 24% of the police service. It was 18% when I first became mayor. So we do what we can with the recurring money. One of the consequences of using one-off money, or money that's only for 3 years, is you've got to find the money elsewhere. So we've now got to find, over the course of the next 2 years, money to replace the business rates money used for some of the 1,300 more offices. So when it comes to prioritising, we know, for example, that the announcement of universal free school meals last year was for 1 year, because I could afford to fund it for 1 year. We're not employing people like police officers. Similarly, this year, I can confidently say I've got money for another year for universal free school meals. If I was to employ civilian staff using potentially one-off money, you'd be the first to criticise me, rightly so next year, by the way, rightly so, if I was having to make redundancies.
I appreciate the assumption that Labour won't remove me from office.
Well, you know.
I may not be back here next year. The serious point is this. You are using that money for the recurring cost of the wages over at TfL, but you're saying you couldn't use it for the recurring cost of police.
That's not right, though, is it? Because the numbers we're talking about, and that we talked about yesterday, are different from the numbers we're talking about in relation to the conversation we're having with transport workers. We already are supporting the police hugely in terms of employment of staff, police officers, community support officers, but also the costs the police have. There is no money from the government, for example, for capital costs for the Met Police Service. So already we are contributing.
So should I infer then from what you've just said that any money that might be coming to the RMT or any other rail union in terms of the strike, that would be one-off money, not recurring money?
No, that's not what I said.
Well, I'm trying to get to the bottom of what you're saying, because you're saying contradictory things. You're saying you can't use the money, the 223 million net business rates that came in to us this week, to you last week. You're saying you can't use that money to fund the Met Police because it would be one-off money, not recurring. But you're saying that you can use it to fund wage increases at TfL. But both of those would be recurring, wouldn't they?
No, I think the figure you were talking about with Enver was a figure of £140 million in relation to the gap, which is the gap we can't fill with the money that we have. So it's prioritising the money we have in relation to expenses we have. You then raised a separate issue in relation to universal free school meals and gave that as the choice that I made as opposed to police officers. You now moved on in relation to the cost of keeping transport running in...
I haven't moved on. I'm on the same point. You're saying that you can't use this £200-odd million that you've received from business rates to fund police because it would be a reoccurring cost, but you're saying you can use it. In fact, you have used it, some amount of it, which you won't disclose, for RMT, but that would be a recurring cost, won't it?
Some will be, yeah. If it's for wages...
So you can use it for recurring costs, but you're saying you can't spend it on the police because it will be a recurring cost?
Well, we already are spending, we already are supporting the police north of 24% in relation to funding. What
you could have supported another 140 million, and you're saying you can't because it's recurring, but you can give recurring money to TfL.
No, sorry, Chair, can I help? This is difficult because we're here to talk about the consultation budget, and now we're talking about things that since it, so you haven't seen the detail. The point about the 140 million for free school meals is, yes, it originally comes from business rates, but you haven't seen the precise way that the allocation works, which obviously we will set out in the draft budget. Yeah, a good chunk of that 140 million is going to come from reserves, which is previous year's business rates, and that as such does not recur. Yeah. So what we have is we've got a couple of things going on here. We've got some money that is in reserves that's come from business rates in the past, yeah, and we've got the new business rates allocations that we've recently learnt about, which are for 24-25, yeah, and so this then becomes, frankly, a complicated situation. And so when we publish the draft budget on Wednesday next week, we will set all that out.
Okay, so which of those pots you just described is the RMT money coming from?
So, as I said, that will come from the firstly, we shouldn't describe it as RMT money because it's for negotiations with all four unions, and it will come from business. It will come from the additional business rates that we are now expecting to receive above what was in the consultation budget.
That's the new money that the Mayor has said couldn't be used for recurring expenses. I
didn't hear him say that. We started answering about the 140 million, which I've said a good chunk of that can't be used for recurring expenses.
Good chunk of it, just the bit that he wants. Okay, I feel I've delved enough. Assembly Member Pigeon, you have some questions on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. You may have heard or seen some of our discussion yesterday about the Met's estate. And back in July last year, Mr. Mayor, you intervened and announced you were saving Uxbridge Police Station. I'm wondering, can you similarly give a commitment today in your budget that you'll save Wimbledon Police Station?
Look, I'm frustrated by the delay in the estate's strategy review being completed, but I understand the reasons for the delay. What I don't want to do is cut across what the Commissioner is trying to do in relation to getting a size of an estate that fits with the size of the police service we will have in a few months' time and in the long term as well. So what I'd prefer to do is let the Commissioner announce his estate's strategy review when he's ready to do so. I'm pushing him to go as soon as he can, but for reasons that I fully understand, it's taken him longer than anticipated.
I appreciate that, but last year you felt able to cut across the Commissioner's review to save Uxbridge Police Station. So I'm specifically asking you, given that they want a judicial review against your decision to close it, will you commit to saving Wimbledon Police Station as well as Teddington Police Station for community use?
I think what you're alluding to is representations I made to the Commissioner about some police buildings in some parts of the city. I think it's right for the Commissioner to be given the time to publish his estate strategy review, and I'm seeing him tomorrow. I'll remind him of the representations you just made in relation to both those police stations and buildings and the strength of feeling there is in those communities.
Okay, thank you. I also just wanted to flag with you, you'll be aware that the Met Commissioner chose not to attend our budget committee meeting yesterday, didn't field any other senior officer who could deal with any operational policing questions. Does this concern you? Will you be picking this up with him when you meet with him next?
I thought there was a senior member. I thought there was a senior member yesterday.
No senior police officer.
No, there wasn't a police officer, but since the Met restructured, and so it's had a, rather than, if you go back to when Craig Mackey was Deputy Commissioner, he had oversight of these things. Since then, the Met's restructured, and it's been a senior civilian who's led on financial matters for Management Board, and so that's why Claire Davies attended.
Okay, I was wondering whether you're concerned about that, Mr. Mayor, and whether you will make representations to the Commissioner.
No, I've no concerns about Claire attending. She's an expert in this area, and that's her responsibility.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I would just to add to that, I would make the observation that the London Fire Brigade Commissioner and the TfL Commissioner and the Chief Executive of the two mayoral development corporations all did come along, and we noted with disappointment that no senior police officer did. Nevertheless, we move on now to a section on climate budgeting. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we heard that in a very exemplary piece of candour, that the the Scope 3 emissions plans are being are not being brought forward because you want to really get on top of the Scope 1 and Scope 2 plans properly. So now in the climate budget, there are Excel tables showing funded and unfunded level 1, which I'm assuming is Scope 1 plans, and funded level 2 plans, but there are no level 2 unfunded plans, which suggests that there's not so much of a pipeline for the Scope 2 emissions plans. So when can we expect to see these? And given that your new carbon budget targets are for 2030, how are they going to impact level 3 targets?
So, Karen, can I explain? First, thanks for your support in this area of our work. Can I just explain that the reason why it's not quite right in relation to Scope 3, the reasons why you won't see more detail next year. We've seen what Oslo did, who are the leaders in this, and former Mayor Raymond Johansson, his legacy will be carbon budgeting, but they took 7 years to get to scope 3. We've got to scope 2 in 2 years. So that's the reason why we're refining.
Yeah, we totally get that, and that's why I said I appreciated the candour. Sure. It's important, but it's still important that you keep the ambition with the work that you are doing in this area. So that's why I was asking about the apparent lack of a future pipeline on scope 2.
So colleagues in the GLA are speaking to members of the London family, local authorities, museums and others in relation to potential things they could be doing that currently may be unplanned, unfunded. And just there are other schemes available for financing, not just City Hall. So the government, for example, has pots of money that can be used as well. So often our money will help them get a case ready. I'm not with the details in relation to potential pipeline in relation to scope 2 unfunded. I can come back to you and drop you a note in relation to what work we've done, but just to reassure you, there are regular conversations City Hall is now leading on with colleagues across the city, not just councils, but other members of the public sector.
Mm-hmm. Can you just say, are you concerned that the fact that we don't seem to have the unfunded level 2 plans being demonstrated, are you concerned at all that could impact your ability to tackle scope 3 emissions? And also, are you at all concerned about the risk that pushing scope 3 more to the future, that decisions could be made around scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that actually might worsen scope 3 emissions? Do you have measures in place to prevent that?
I'm not sure I can answer that. What I can say is we're not working on potential scope 3 issues because it's not down in the carbon budget. But maybe Enver can explain the conversation we've had with other parts of the London family in relation to this work.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You thanked me for my candour last time, and I'll continue on that line. One of the reasons for not including scope 3 is because it's in the too hard category. And one of the reasons for saying it's too hard is we said we want to bed down scope 2. And the environment team struggled this year to be able to do the unfunded bit of scope 2. So one of the urgent priority pieces of work for us before thinking about embedding scope 3 is to get scope 2 right. So although I can't give you an exact time because I'm not the expert on the unfunded element of scope 2, my team will help cost it, but the list needs to be drawn up. So that pipeline sort of exists in draft, but not in a state that I would be happy to publish. So that's the work that we would be doing, hopefully, so that either next year or at latest the year after, we would then hopefully be able to put some estimates against scope 2, and that's what I call embedding scope 2. It doesn't mean, if we're not doing climate budgeting, that the work isn't happening in terms of prioritisation, though. So the environment team, who are the experts in this, would already be working on scope 3 impacts and scope 2 impacts. It's just, if you think of this as a total budget document, I'd like there to be a level of accuracy before it gets incorporated and published. We're working with other cities, so just so you're aware, in terms of how we cost it and how we build that unfunded bit of scope 2, in that family that we've created across the world of 13 cities plus Oslo, we're hoping that we'll get some cooperation through the new toolkit, and hopefully we can move forward to publishing scope 2.
And just to reassure you, Caroline, I mean, the whole circular economy is about scope 3, actually. So we are doing work around circular economy, working with colleagues about how we can make sure we address the issues of scope 3, even though it's not in the carbon budget.
Okay, thank you. What about the fact that MOPAC hasn't provided any funded scope 2 plans? And are you worried about that? And are you expecting to publish them sometime soon?
I think this may be linked with Caroline Pigeon's question about the estate strategy and the work taking place there. I expect that you'll have far more detail in relation to that this time next year, in relation to the work would be done during the course of the year, but in relation to that piece of work. And I think it may be a question of if an estate's going to be sold off, question mark, the work required from the GLA and MOPAC, but definitely be progress made over the course of the next period.
Okay, thank you. Now, it was announced last week that the Green Finance Fund has secured 190 million in funding from the UK Infrastructure Bank. So this is the Green Finance Fund. You were sort of hoping to get that to 500 million. So how confident are you that you're going to get the other 310 million for the Green Finance Fund? And yes, is there anything else you can share about that?
It is good news in relation to the partial funding of the £500 million. Again, maybe David and Enver may want to explain optimism without the bias in relation to the rest of the money, in relation to optimism to get there.
Thank you. So, I mean, obviously one of the points about this facility, full stop, is that we want to offer competitive interest rates to encourage people to use the facility, make the investments and deliver the carbon reductions. That's what's so good about UKIB, because that funding is cheaper than Public Works Loan Board. And as you'll remember, Assembly Member, that was always our test around, originally we were looking to do a green bond. We still, when we reach the point that the cash flows are such that we need to bring in the external funding to pass through, well then, if the green bond's the cheapest thing to do, then we would do that. Otherwise, we would use Public Works Loan Bond. But the fact that we've secured such a high proportion of the 500 million at sub-PWLB rates does enable us to offer some discount in our interest rates to schemes, so that on its own puts us in a really good place.
And what about getting the other 310 million? Do you have a sense that that's coming?
So as I say, we could borrow it within days from the Public Works Loan Board.
I see what you mean.
If we needed to. As it is for now, we can manage through the GLA's cash flow, given that we only actually pass the money out as the people receiving it spend it. But when we reach that point that we can't do that, we will use Public Works Loan Body unless there's a better alternative between now and then.
So does that mean you can lend out the whole 500 million? Yeah.
So we're absolutely able to do that. Now the reality is that some of these schemes that we will be lending to are big multi-year schemes, and so we'll only need to give them the cash as they actually spend it through the course of each project. Yeah. So it's not like we need £500 to pass out today, but the point is ensuring that we have the money available to do that, and we've got the money from the UK Infrastructure Bank, we've got the GLA's cash flow, and then we will follow up either PWLB, Green Bond, or some other approach, whatever is financially the best option.
It goes back to an issue you raised a few minutes ago, Carol, about having the projects and schemes actually rather than the finance at this stage.
Okay, so at the moment there aren't enough schemes to bid for that money, are you saying?
We've got a criteria, and there's a separate board that decides the criteria. The good news about this portion of the £500 million, £190 million, is that it's more favourable. But it's a question of the people coming forward, satisfying the criteria, us lending the money, which is a loan, lending it, for them to maybe apply for other pots of money on the private sector market, or themselves having the money. But that money is there, and we're letting people know the money is there. And the colleagues Enver referred to in the environment team are working with colleagues across London about making submissions, making bids.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of getting this money out the door and actually being used to help you meet the very strong targets you've got for 2030, are there any other things that need to be in place for you to feel that pipeline is strong and that it's possible to spend that money?
So, I mean, I think we've got a process, Assembly Member. I think it's working well. We've just had the close of expressions of interest for the latest round. So, officers will obviously do some initial work, and then in a couple of weeks I expect to hear more about that, and we'll review where those expressions of interest are likely to lead us, and whether there's any more we need to do. But I think with a combination of the work that we're doing within the group as set out in the climate budget, the situation with the UK Investment Bank, and the fact that means we are able to make a positive offer to external partners, and there's discussions that are ongoing. I personally think we're in a pretty good place, but we will see what this round of expressions of interest
Okay, and
brings.
so just final question: when will we learn about this?
Enver, is that one more for you?
I got given some figures yesterday, hot off the press. I can't share them yet because they've gone through no analysis at all, but there's been 6 bids in the latest round, which is in addition to the bids we had before in the last round in the autumn. So some of those are still working their way through the pipeline. So as I explained before, 185 million has already been allocated. Then there's going to be the next batch from the ones that came in autumn. And then before those have been exhausted, we've got these ones that have just come in that need to go through the due diligence as well.
Great, thank you very much. That's very encouraging.
Okay, thank you. I have a very quick, he assures me,
extremely quick.
From Andrew Boff.
You're committed to incorporating Scope 3 emissions in our climate targets. Is that correct?
You mean the budget or the target?
Within your plans for the future.
Our target is to get to 0 emissions by 2030.
I know that will include Scope 3
Oh, yeah.
emissions. Included in those Scope 3 emissions will be, don't you think signing the plant-based treaty might be a good idea as well? By definition, it's an emission, it's a Scope 3 aim.
I'm happy to have colleagues go and look into your suggestion of that.
Yeah, it would be nice if they answered my question, which I asked some months ago and haven't received a reply from.
I'll chase that up, Andrew.
Thank you.
Plants do move slowly, Andrew. Next section is housing, which is Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you so much. And just Happy New Year to you all, and what a great start to the year it is with the excellent news of the free school meal programs being extended. Coming on to housing, the government has failed to meet their own targets around affordable homes under the Affordable Housing Programme. But conversely, you've met yours, and you've started more than 116,000 homes, new affordable homes across London, which is excellent news. How will you ensure that £625 million you have allocated in the 24-25 budget will be used successfully?
So, firstly, just the other good news in relation to the homes we've begun is I think almost 60% are completed, which is great news. Obviously, it takes some time for permission being granted and the homes being started and the homes being completed. And so we've had a challenging year in relation to getting agreement from DLUC in relation to a number of issues. 'Cause obviously, the initial window was 21 to 26. That was delayed, so it's now 23 to 26. We've agreed with the government 23,900, roughly speaking, starts over those 3 years. But there are a number of uncertainties this year. You're well aware of the 18 metres issue with second staircases. There are all sorts of macroeconomic issues in relation to interest rates and inflation and so forth. Sales are the lowest they've been since 2010. Starts are the lowest they've been for some years as well. So this year is going to be very, very difficult. We're doing what we can, working with colleagues, the private sector, housing associations, councils and so forth. The more flexibility the government gives, the easier it is in relation to getting starts off the ground, but it is going to be tough. And so we are speaking to the government about what additional funding they can give to support at a time when it's a potential opportunity by being counter-cyclical, more affordable homes, because we know the challenges in the private sector market, and it's actually an opportunity with the right support from government. And I know Tom Copley met yesterday with the relevant minister in the government to discuss some of these issues.
Thank you for that.
Assembly Member Boff.
How many new homes will you not be building as a result of your council homes acquisition programme?
So the CHAP scheme is a scheme that takes place across the country, and what the government's agreed with colleagues across the country, including London, is up to 30% per year can be homes acquired by councils, new build. If they're second hand, it's up to 10% per year, and that's been taking place even before I was mayor. That's the cap. You obviously can't go above that. It all depends on availability of homes for councils to purchase.
So how many new homes does that equate to? New homes for people who are living in overcrowded positions, overcrowded conditions, new homes for people in housing need, new homes for people who possibly don't qualify for social homes. How many new homes will you not be building as a result of that allocation?
I'm not sure how to say this in a respectful way. In a consolidation draft budget, I'd have those figures. I'm more than happy to ask the Deputy Mayor to correspond to in relation to those sorts of numbers.
What's the total amount you've allocated to the council house allocations acquisition programme?
Well, as I explained, it's demand-led, but it's up to a maximum of 30% of new, up to a maximum of 10% second-hand.
What does that equate to in numbers, in figures, in pounds?
Well, in terms of units of housing, which is what I've got at the fore of my mind rather than figures in pounds, it's 23,900 divided by 3, divided by then 30% of that per year, or 10% of that per year.
But you absolutely recognise that by spending your time acquiring former council homes, you are not providing new homes.
So it's a government initiative, not a City Hall initiative.
I
but it's a lot
they
quicker.
made you do it, did they?
But it's a lot quicker. So it means that family that you're concerned about, as indeed I am, aren't waiting for years for a home to be completed, because a home that has been built by the private sector, for example, that can't be sold has been acquired, which means a family can live in it rather than being empty.
Don't you accept that the problem with London is that we don't have sufficient stock of housing, and that the priority should be to increase that stock rather than just moving deck chairs around?
Which is one of the reasons why the Housing Task Force, chaired by Tom Copley, did a piece of work for the government that set out the cost of increasing supply commensurate with the demand for our city. We receive a sixth of the money needed to increase supply to meet the demand, and it's incredibly important we address those issues of increasing supply. The whole point, according to the government, which I agree, of having a CHAP scheme is it speeds up the ability of the family in the council housing waiting list, the family in temporary accommodation, move into a home that's sitting empty, rather than waiting for a number of years for a home to be built with the combination of both.
Will you therefore, Mr Mayor, prioritise, if you are going to proceed with the council house acquisition programme, that you only purchase family-sized homes?
A significant proportion are family-sized homes, but also you've got people living in overcrowded accommodation as adults, 30 plus, who need 1-2 bedroom homes as well. We need homes of all sizes for our city, including, in particular, family-sized homes as well.
360,000 young people are being brought up in overcrowded conditions in this city. Don't you think their needs are greater?
I would hope you'd make that point forcefully to Michael Gove and the government.
I have done repeatedly. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Assembly Member Harani.
On a serious note, I did meet officials from Harrow Council recently, and looking at their budgets, they told me, which was published in their draft bill, there was a £19 million gap in them meeting their financial needs. Now, they told me the two biggest areas that they were concerned about was an adult social care overspend and the temporary accommodation bill. So how important is it that you have homes available immediately through CHAPS so that that can ease the pressure off councils locally as well? And also what discussions are taking place with local councils in terms of temporary accommodation at the moment, and how does it compare to previous years in terms of the numbers and figures for TA locally?
You're well aware that the consequences of the housing crisis and the impact also on not just families but on our budgets, and so it's really important to recognise that the sooner we can get homes that can be used by families, the sooner those families are ameliorated of their distress caused by overcrowding and other issues, quality of housing and so forth, but also we can be reducing the bill the councils face in relation to temporary accommodation. And so, I a few minutes ago complimented the government on the CHAP scheme. I'm surprised that colleagues in the Assembly want to slow down the provision of homes for families in London. I think it's possible to have CHAPs, council homes acquired properties, and at the same time increase the supply of new homes. And there's a huge opportunity for the reasons I've said in answer to Anne Clark's question, because of the macroeconomics. Private developers are not able to sell those homes. Well, actually an opportunity for the state to step in and to be building more council homes.
Thank you. Well, that only 2 minutes over our time brings to an end, very nearly an end, actually, of our questions for the first phase of our meeting this morning. I just have one final question, if I may sneak it in. So the consultation on your consultation budget ends tomorrow. So this committee we had significant meetings yesterday with LFB and the Met, with you this morning, and also shortly our panel of experts. Obviously, it's a very tight deadline for us to get all of our recommendations and things to you by tomorrow. Is it possible for you to consider response from the committee if it's received after that date?
I'm sure it would be, David.
Yeah, we can do that. As we've said, responses to the consultation process, cost of the timeline have to be considered for the final draft budget, not the draft budget. So you won't see it, and whatever steps are taken until the final draft on 14th February. But we're happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, on that high point, thank you very much, gentlemen, this morning. So I can thank our first panel for this morning's meeting, attending and answering our questions. We will now have a short adjournment of, let's say, 5 minutes until 11:08, while our second panel, the reconvened panel of our external experts, finds their way into the chamber. Thank you, everyone. Hello and good morning everyone. Welcome back to the second part of our Budget and Performance Committee meeting this morning. We have our second panel of guests, which is the return of our panel of outside experts looking at the way the GLA sets its budget. We have with us in the chamber this morning, we have Professor Tony Travers, who is visiting professor at London School of Economics, Department of Government and Director at LSE London. Good morning, Tony. We also have Stuart Hoggan, who is Associate Consultant, LG Futures. Morning, Stuart. And joining us remotely, we have Alfie Sterling, who is Chief Economist and Associate Director at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Good morning, Alfie. So if I'll kick off, I think some of you also saw the earlier panel with the Mayor that we've just had, so you may have reflections on that as well. But I suppose the big question is, obviously, thinking about since last time you were here, we've had now the Mayor's consultation budget for 24-25 and his responses earlier this morning, and some announcements that have come out that are not officially part of the budget process, but somehow have made it into the news. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on, A, those developments, and B, in terms of the changes that you've seen and the priorities and what you read into that. So perhaps you'd like to kick off, Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. So I think the first thing to say, of course, is this is a long and complex document which reflects the nature of the GLA group. The second thing that strikes you, of course, is it's very much an evolving position, which is what you've referred to. The document is based in large part on the assumptions in the initial GLA assumptions document in the summer, and has not been able to reflect the material from government, which came out very much at the time of publication. So there's a heavy contingent air to it, and not just in that respect. It's clear, for example, it relies in part on money from other sources that's not yet confirmed, for example, Home Office grants and the police. It refers to efficiency savings that are not yet fully worked through, so are work in train. So there's a strong sense of a contingent air to the document, and of course we've seen more recent announcements that are firming up the position as it becomes clearer the resources that will be available to the Mayor in the coming financial year. It's probably also worth mentioning at this point, of course, that there are absolutely no assumptions or information available from central government about the following year, which makes it difficult for any local authority to budget on the medium to longer term in these circumstances. The other thing that's maybe worth mentioning at the outset is it's something that I think I touched on at the earlier session, is the absence of any clear output or outcome measures in the material that give a sense of how the Mayor struck the investment decisions that he made and the trade-offs across the budget, and indeed the outcomes that he hopes to see and could be held accountable for as part of the process. There is, ironically, much more information now about the carbon impact of the budget, which of course is very, very welcome. But there's more information on that than there is on the actual direct outputs of the investment, as far as I read the material that we've had available to us. So the other point, which I guess we'll come to as part of the session, is that there's a bit of a sense across the material, as far as we've been able to secure in the time available, that some areas of the budget are more robust and seem more defensible than others. So to my reading, the TFL material seemed more secure. The police material seemed much more contingent, and I think there is an inconsistency there. That's maybe all I'll say at the outset. We'll obviously come to issues in more detail as we go through.
Absolutely, I'm sure we will. Thank you, Stuart. Tony.
Okay, well, I agree with all that Stuart has said there. I mean, this document is it's a large, complex document laid out in a particular way. The GLA is a unique institution in many ways. It's very different to local authorities, although the functional bodies themselves in the GLA are local authorities. You know, it's substantially better than anything national government would do. If you compare the annual budget and supply estimates process in central government, it'd be very hard for the public to read and comment on them, and indeed very little discussion is undertaken other than of the actual budget and tax changes. So anything I say critically ought to be heard against that backdrop. So I think this document, not just for this year, brings together the various functional bodies and City Hall's own spending into one consolidated document, which is quite an effort. And in many ways, the individual functional bodies' business plans and financial reporting is probably easier to understand than when it's all brought into this complicated document. I totally take Stuart's point about the lack of outcome or output measures, which one might have expected. And the other thing, I think, to make this document more helpful for this committee and for public comprehension more generally in the long term, more time series are needed. I think having outcome, a sort of estimated outturn and 1 year forward figures, again, Stuart's right. The GLA no more than anybody else knows public spending figures for 25-26. We'll have to wait for a spending review, which may yet come after a general election for that. But I think trying to put these numbers in some context over time would make it far easier to work out what's going on to council tax, what's going on to spending on individual services and so on. So I'd add that also to what Stuart said. I think, to reiterate, the problem for all public authorities, including the GLA, that is inherent in the annual Christmas local government finance settlement. This is not unique to this government, but you know, publishing details on the 17th or 18th or 16th of December, and then expecting within a month, mostly Christmas, it would be impossible for a local authority to do all that work then, so it all has to be done in advance. So it makes the whole process, and indeed this kind of examination in public, which is highly to be encouraged, the more difficult than if we had longer term public spending plans, which councils, and in this case the GLA, could then give us much more and longer term numbers for projected budgets and planning into the future and risk management into the future.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I think a couple of themes emerging there. And finally, Alfie, what are your thoughts on what's happened since you were here last?
Thanks a lot. I mean, yeah, I agree with a lot of what Tony and Stuart have said. I would emphasise, I think, the two really key points that's emerged from those contributions, which is firstly the lack of outcome or output-based metrics. I think is really critical, really important to be able to hold a document and a process and decisions to account. And the second is the time series point, being able to situate this budget across a period of time, notwithstanding the points about uncertainty going forward, as we're all waiting for confirmation on spending decisions going forward, but certainly backwards looking, I think it would be particularly helpful. So we just want to emphasise those 2 points you've already heard. The only other thing I wanted to mention is, stepping back, and I thought the conversation just now was a very helpful one. I think it's a testament, the conversation you had with the Mayor and his colleagues was a very helpful one. I think it's a testament to a good process that's taking place in public, that these conversations are happening at this point in time. But stepping back, I feel like the thing that I'd most want to say is that both the nature of that conversation and actually the materials that have been provided so far don't feel as though they offer urgency that is commensurate with some of the challenges that we're seeing in London, across the country, in terms of just the dire economic and living standards picture. So it very much feels like a tanker that's moving along with lots of credit to that process and to that that course, but with perhaps a slight inability to be responsive to the external world that's happening around us. And I think there are three areas of particular concern, which I did highlight a few months ago, but I think if anything, they are more true now than they were 3 months ago, which is that firstly, of course, rising inflation that we've had doesn't disappear. It leaves us with higher prices. As I think, Chair, as you made the point earlier, inflation compounds. So that is now a pressure that is not going away. It is here for this year, and it is here in just as severe form as it was last year. The second, I think more concerning, is that we are seeing families, exhaust their coping mechanisms to deal with the cost of living crisis. Again, this was something I mentioned 3 months ago, but since then, the JRF has completed our second survey of the year in terms of the cost of living crisis for low-income families. That was published in November with data from October. And being unable to rely on savings, being unable to rely on family members for support, being unable to take out loans. Many of these loans are being used to pay for essentials, and that is dwindling. So despite inflation subsiding, because the coping mechanisms are exhausting, the material and welfare impact could be more severe over the next 12 months than it was over the previous 12. Finally, the final reason why I'm particularly concerned about the external environment into which this process is delivering again is much worse than it was 3 months ago. So we've had very poor GDP results come in the last quarter. We're in negative territory at the moment. And the really worrying thing is it looks like the lag on interest rates, so rising interest rates in order to contain inflation, it looks like the lag has been longer than was previously perhaps expected by many policymakers and decision makers over the last 12 months, partly because there were lots of savings from the pandemic, which have had a boost because of high interest rates, and that's held up spending a little bit, partly because mortgages are increasingly on fixed rates, and that's just delayed the effect. So, but that all tells us that although last year we didn't see the income hit the OBR initially forecast, it does look as though some of that hit will now come in the next 12 months as opposed to the previous 12. So taking all that together, my overwhelming feeling is this process going to be responsive enough to that tiering external living standards environment?
Thank you. Actually, you've segued beautifully onto what was going to be my next and final question, which is, we asked you what your 3 priorities were last time and have they changed? And I think perhaps, Alfie, I don't know whether you want to add to what you've just said, but it feels like you've just laid out, A, what they were, and B, reiterated that they are the same and, if anything, more urgent. So I want to give you an opportunity to add anything if you wish, but you know, it sounds like...
That's right.
Fair enough, thank you. So going back along, Tony, what would you like to add or change or amend or rethink the 3? I realise there's a bit of an exam question thing here, isn't there? What did I say last time? Oh my God.
Yes, I'm not sure I can remember what I said last time.
But you can tell us afresh what you think in the light of everything.
The thing that's, and in the light of what Alfie and Stuart have said, one of the standout long-term implications of this document, particularly if you could look at Section 9, which is the longer-term capital planning that the GLA wishes to put forward, that the level of capital investment is well short of those figures for the future. And I think by capital spending, London has a £500 billion economy, so annual investment by the public sector to support basic provision in the city. Now, what would be an appropriate figure? Well, probably larger than the sort of £4.5 billion or whatever the number is in this document here. So I think that's the sort of long-term standout thought I have, which is that it's clear that capital investment is nowhere near what is necessary. And of course, in fairness to the GLA, it's very dependent on obviously debt limits, the extent to which it can borrow further through the functional bodies and centrally, but also on central government decisions about investment as well. So that is if I can add, if that is different to what I said last time, that's the thing I'd say differently.
Well, we won't mark you down if it's different, but I appreciate it. I think that's interesting. It tallies actually with some of the things we were hearing yesterday from the Fire Brigade and Met. Stuart?
I think I said last time transport, police and the environment, and I think I would stand by those as the top priorities. The budget material shows a depth of thinking on the environment, which in my experience would put it in the forefront of public sector bodies in this country, and that's obviously very, very good to see. There's more to do, of course, but the level of ambition is high, and the progress made to this point is very welcome. I mentioned already that my sense is that the transport budget has a degree of grip around it, and the prioritisation to stay within the available resources has clearly been thought about a great deal. The policing budget doesn't quite convey that sense of grip, and there's obviously a dialogue with the Home Office that's going on, and the Mayor will have certain tactics in relation to that. It's far from clear that in terms of the two budgets that have been put forward, that the optimum final budget is either of those. It may well be something in the middle. So there's a bit of a sense of this is what will happen unless you do something to help us, Home Office. But the reality is probably between the two. And just going back a bit in terms of outcome measures and performance and accountability, Tony's absolutely right. Of course, the formal material from government tells no story at all. But it is, I think, worth reflecting that previous administrations have published much more and have foregrounded performance management through public service agreements, for example, that was at least a step in this direction, and that material's no longer there at the moment. I think I probably also mentioned the presentation of the budget is quite interesting. The way that the council tax increases are pitched towards the highest political priorities, which is of course a way of helping to justify what are quite significant increases across the board. I think an 8.6% increase in the precept overall, if I understood the figures correctly. And there's a degree of non-ring fencing of the budgets, which means that you could frame it in a different way. But obviously, as this is right, the Mayor has pitched this in the most positive way that he could find. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's it for my sort of opening sort of context questions. So we're now going to move through a series of topics on the different areas, starting with housing with Assembly Member Boff.
Thank you. Mr. Hoggan, what do you see as the primary risks and opportunities that the Mayor may encounter in achieving his housing targets for the fiscal year 24-25?
So my understanding is that the housing programme is funded primarily from outside the GLA's resources, that what the GLA brings to bear is the running costs funded from business rates resources. And so the primary risk must be the political turbulence at the national level. And the availability of resources from central government and other sources to secure that programme.
Well, it manages a very large amount of money.
Yes.
It's not originated within the GLA,
exactly.
But it does manage that. So effectively, it is mayoral funds. Do you think that they're being spent in the best possible way?
Well, I think this takes us back immediately to the lack of output measures and value for money assurance around elements of the programme, and in a way that allows us to compare between the GLA and other organisations. If the money is coming from central government, then it's a priority of central government to demonstrate that value for money is being secured from the resources that they're making available. But I think the GLA could do more to be more transparent on that in this, in the specific circumstances of the London housing market.
When you say transparent, how do you mean?
I mean having a stronger sense of the outcomes that are expected to be achieved and foregrounding that in the budget material, and showing, as Tony said, over time whether outputs have been achieved in the way that was anticipated in previous years.
Thank you. Professor Travers, how do you feel about the housing budget?
Going back to something I was saying earlier, where you've got functional bodies like Transport for London or the Fire Authority or Fire Brigade and fire spending, it's much easier to get a sense of how, certainly you can look into their own detailed reports to find out more about what is going on. With housing spending, from this in this document, there isn't a great deal of detail, to be honest, about there's some headline spending figures, but as Stuart has said, not much about the expected outcomes or change or any changes in expected outcome. So I think it's hard to judge, to answer your question directly. And of course, it's also worth adding that the government has itself recently commissioned a review of the London plan, as you'll be more aware than me, very short-term review of it, with a view to more central government intervention in London housing. It's hard to work out exactly how that's going to fit with what's in this document, because this document obviously would have been prepared before that intervention was announced.
What do you think is behind that, government's motivation behind that? Do you?
Well, that is a large question.
It is a bit.
Let's try and do this carefully. I think you know the story. I mean, the government wants a national housing target of 300,000 delivered, but doesn't, for most of the country, want housing targets. Though London, via the London plan, does have housing targets, effectively, and the government clearly thinks that in some parts of London those targets are not big enough. That, I think, is what, if I can deconstruct everything I can see in housing. Quite whether this the panel that's been created will be able to identify sufficient space to drive up housing delivery from, 35,000 to 70,000 a year, whatever the need is that the government states, personally I think is unlikely, but we'll find out when that report is published. Best I could do, sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Sterling, what do you think of the challenges?
I agree with a lot of what Stuart and Tony have said. I think that actually the main thing I would add, and it's an example of the point I was making earlier around responsiveness and a budget that's commensurate with the environment it's playing into, and this point I think actually runs perhaps a little counter to your line of questioning of the Mayor earlier, is that I do think there is a larger opportunity due to the prevailing macroeconomic conditions to add housing stock quickly into affordable and social housing tenure through acquisition, or particularly where you see buy-to-let landlords with buy-to-let mortgages being increasingly pushed to a sell position by higher interest rates. That presents an opportunity to do more to improve the tenure mix of London through state-funded or state actors, bringing those properties into social housing tenure groups. Now, your point to the Mayor, I think, is absolutely spot on, which is that clearly there is an overall supply question, falling short of overall demand, both in terms of both at aggregate and at disaggregate levels across the capital. But there is also a tenure mix problem and an affordability problem within the supply of housing. And I think this point can be addressed through more assertive action. And you call it shuffling the deck chairs, but if you can change the cost of the deck chair, then that can help a family. And you can change the speed at which that deck chair is delivered, that will help a family. And I think the prevailing economic conditions allow for more to be done in that space through acquisitions than is currently being provided for.
Wouldn't you agree that an awful large number of Londoners wouldn't even be allowed to sit in a deck chair?
Yes, and that points to the context that I was trying to emphasise. So, and for example, we know from our data that while across the country you have 7 million families that are foregoing essential items. That's and that's about 63% of low-income families in the country. In London, it's 76%. It's 13 percentage points higher in the capital. So absolutely, the level of need across housing and other basic services and goods is particularly acute.
So would you say that there's just a problem of stock in the affordable sector, or a problem of stock everywhere?
Both. I think we have an overall supply problem. I think we have a tenure and mix problem as well, as it pertains to affordability.
So by acquiring those properties, you reduce the amount of stock in the non-affordable properties and try and increase it with the affordable properties, and affordable properties which the majority of Londoners aren't entitled to move into.
Yes, so of course it's not a solution to every housing problem, but as I said, alongside an increase in supply, there's an opportunity for that particular intervention to help in particular circumstances.
And do you recognise that intervening in one part of the housing market in London, of course there's loads of housing markets in London, not just one, but by intervening in one housing market in London, you can distort to its disadvantage other parts of the housing market in London?
Yes, of course. It's a complex system, a series of markets. But the point is that is already being distorted if you like, they're changing prevailing macroeconomic conditions. So you don't have a static market out there either, that which just intervention from a state body just then distorts. You have that picture constantly evolving and changing in view of external environment, and the extent to which the state can either improve that market or distort it negatively depends on judgment and good appraisal and the right policy intervention given that external environment. So I'm not saying all intervention is good. I'm not saying that this particular opportunity is going to be a silver bullet for all different problems, but I think there is an opportunity to do more in acquisition than is perhaps currently being done.
So would you say, for example, that the one measure that does benefit all housing markets is just increasing the stock?
Yes, and I think increasing the supply of housing is, as you and both the mayors said, I think is a priority, and I would agree with.
Thank you. After the Kerslake review on affordable housing delivery in London, the Mayor initially adopted a recommendation to pilot a city developer model, but later he adopted the joint venture partnership approach. Which do you, Mr. Sterling, do you think is the best approach? Do you think that was a wise move on behalf of the Mayor?
I don't think I'm across those details enough to give a useful view. So,
any of the other guests here have a view on that? No, great. That's more time for other people. Generally, the Kerslake review criticised a sort of a rather fragmented approach to housing delivery. Is that something that guests would support? Professor Travers?
I'll have a go. Obviously the London, the demand for housing in London is in, and it always has been, as far as my entire working life, always in crisis. There's the distribution of housing at any point in time. So even in the late 1970s, when the population of London had fallen by 2 million and large numbers of homes had been built since 1945, there was still a housing crisis. So the challenge at any point is to sort of deconstruct what the current problem is and for whom it is most severe, and then target action accordingly. And no sphere of public policy, in my experience, and I'm not an expert on housing, is as overlaid not only with the politics of the past, but a whole array of different ways of approaching the issue in a way that, say, doesn't exist for transport or the NHS to anything like the same degree. So, but the one thing I would say is that the clear and present problem that London faces over time is a lack of new housing supply. I think the point you were making, I totally agree with that. And the issue of how to drive up overall housing supply, if we just put to one side whether it's affordable with a capital A or just in total, I think is something that is particularly problematic in London and the wider southeast, and it's not so much of a problem in the rest of the United Kingdom, and that means in turn that because it's largely a London and southeast issue, it's not a national challenge in quite the way it would be if it were NHS waiting lists or the performance of the National Railway.
I mean, you almost alluded to what was said earlier. Everyone who comes here who's presented a budget says it was an exceptional year, and actually the crisis, as you said, has been every year that I've been involved in London politics, and perhaps more attention to the root causes of that might be better of the housing crisis.
I mean, as I say, the word I have used the word crisis, and you have, and I think there is a crisis with housing, and one try, not to use it too much, but it does change. The nature of it changes. I mean, that's the thing where we need more information about the particular nature of the problem. For whom, many people don't have a problem with housing in London, but a substantial minority have a very significant problem. So identifying where the problem lies, what can be done about it in greater detail over time. I mean, coming back to Stuart's original point, I think the more documents of this kind look into the future and give a clue as to how in this case housing, is to be, or the crisis to be moderated over time, the better it would be in terms of having this kind of discussion.
Mr. Hoggan, you talked about lack of transparency earlier. Is that something that might help?
As Tony suggested, this is something that could easily lend itself to more transparency. And of course, the dilemma that Tony points out is acute for central government, because they have to decide whether the numbers in the increases that they're looking for should be located more towards the north of the country, where costs are lower but demand may be less, or should be focused on the south of the country, where the number of houses might be a smaller number for the amount of money that's available. And successive governments have always struggled with that north-south dilemma. Where do they focus the priority? Another of the earlier themes was the complex nature of the different housing markets in London, and the risks of perverse outcomes from particular interventions. I mean, my personal view is always pragmatic on these matters. The scheme that was described earlier about acquiring public and affordable housing where the market is suitable for that is a very immediate way of increasing the supply of affordable housing, and I personally would welcome that. If there are effects on the broader housing market, it seems to me that those are more second-order effects, and there are bigger forces acting on the broader housing market. The priority for me is can you get the supply increased in the shorter term, which is what that scheme aims to do. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I finish on housing, is there anybody, Mr. Sterling, do you want to come in on any of that before I finish on the housing section?
No, that's fine. Nothing further to add.
Thank you very much. You've answered all my questions, ones that I was yet to answer. Yes, yet to ask. So thank you very much, and I'll back to the chair.
Thank you. Yeah, just to pick up your point, Tony, about the difference between this bit, the housing bit, and the other bits. I mean, when we had this meeting where we sat here and we talked to the housing people, the problem is we had housing people from TfL, from the GLA housing team, from Old Oak Common and Park Rural Development Corporation, from the LLDC, each one, of course, doing their own bit. It's not obvious how you can coordinate those because, of course, they're, as you say, they're independent sort of bodies really doing their own thing. So I don't know whether you had any thoughts on how some transparency or oversight could be brought other than just, you know, us doing our best within this building. But I think we would all recognise that that's a distinct difference versus, say, looking at transport overall or looking at police overall.
I think there's a broader theme here which we touched on in the earlier section, was the way that the different parts of the GLA group work together. There is some material in the budget on what I describe as corporate services and efficiencies across the board, and that's good to see, and suggests that there's £10 million of savings per annum. But it seems to me there's likely to be a great deal more that can be done both in policy terms and in operational terms across the group. I imagine there's fierce independence in the different parts of the group, but there are some upsides for having these all within the mayor's ambit.
Yeah, no, there absolutely is. You're right. Oh, Tony, you.
Yeah, just to add one thing. I mean, listening to this discussion, having this discussion, and at the risk of further burdening people who work in this building, I mean, the discussion we're having does suggest the potential need for a sort of sister document to this one, which wouldn't be the annual accounts, but a sort of performance and outcome report, which looked at the spending in the light of objectives to produce an annual analysis, which would make this committee's life rather easier, I think, than just looking at the budget.
Yes, that's a very good. I mean, I didn't pick up on it, or I didn't comment on it, but I made a note of, in my initial set of questions about context and so on, the point about measurable outcomes and the point about more historic time series data. I think those are definitely points we'll take away, and that's a very good one. Stuart, you had another good idea.
And building on that theme, this is of course something it's not immediately applicable for the current year's budget, but if the committee wanted to see this, it's something that you need to look forward to next year and the year after. It's not something you can produce overnight, but I think you can see a sense from all three of us that this is something that we think is lacking compared to other bodies.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very useful. I don't know if you I mean, it was more of an observation than a question, actually, so I wasn't. But I appreciate your observations on that. I think that's very worthwhile. We'll certainly note those down. So I don't see any more indications on housing, so we'll move on to our next section, which is Transport for London with Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. Tony, you talked about capital being one of your concerns overall with this budget, and I think many of us feel the same. In terms of TfL, they now say they're able to deliver their full programme of improvements despite only getting half of the capital that they had bid for, if we can say that, from government, partly by rephrasing things like their Siemens mobility contract and so on. How sustainable is that? And what are your thoughts on the size of the capital funding settlement for Transport for London? Can I start with you, Tony?
Okay, well, I mean, the thing about TfL, and to some extent the discussion we've just had about housing, perhaps rather less to do with policing, fire and emergencies, other services, is that capital investment is, and I'm not saying capital isn't important in the police estate and the fire estate, but it's not as key to the daily operation as it would be for transport or housing. Excuse me. And against that backdrop, the annual nature or the near annual nature of financial settlements, or even more short term with TfL, is not good government. You need long-term funding settlements, which would allow not just purchases of new tube trains and or indeed, you know, building new infrastructure, but separately, and much more importantly in many ways, the maintenance of the existing infrastructure that makes the system operate day by day. So I think that this is something that definitely needs to be a message, if I may say so, strongly sent to national government, this one, any national government, that annualised settlements, which are not great for local government as a whole, are particularly problematic for transport and housing, where investment goes on over a much longer period.
And what's your view then of the way TfL says they can sort of manage the sticking plaster, the renegotiating contracts? Is that literally just a one-off, one-year measure, or do you think they can do that over several years in order to try to eke out the money that they're getting?
Well, TfL has an enormous amount of flexibility. I mean, one of the looking at the overall analysis of the GLA group, this huge chunk of income from fares is very different to something you'd see in any other equivalent document for any other city, regional authority, or indeed, you know, to some extent, national authority in the country. So TfL, and actually TfL has been much more successful at rebuilding its fare income after the pandemic than the National Railway has. Okay, so TfL is far closer, in fact its fare yield is above what it, I think I've just checked these figures, it's above what it was before the pandemic, where for the National Railway it's well behind. National Railway is still only getting 80% of fare income. So TfL has greater flexibility in the capacity to move resources around its own budget, particularly if fare income turns out to be more buoyant. And by the way, London and the South East fare income for the National Railway and for TfL is far more buoyant than the rest of the country at the moment. So TfL has flexibilities inside its budget, which again takes me back to a point I was making earlier, that whilst it is absolutely right and proper to have this discussion about this document because this is the Mayor's budget, going deeper into TfL's own budget and business plan makes it possible to kind of, you know, go further into the need for long-term resourcing, be it from TfL's own resources or from government funding, because that is what's essential to make a railway and indeed the bus and road system function properly.
Okay, Stuart, what's your thoughts on this? And also, point I don't know if you heard that I raised with the Mayor earlier about what financial sustainability actually means, because the government seems to have added in that it needs to cover capital enhancements and renewals, which the Mayor and his team this morning said was a new definition of financial sustainability. What's your take on this?
So this is actually the 6th consecutive 1-year settlement from central government, which is extraordinary and appalling at the same time. I should, of course, confess that I led a number of those when I worked in central government, so I can't be overly critical. But you know, it is a dreadful record for public bodies to have to try and manage their way through. As I said earlier, there is a sense of sort of grip within the TfL material in terms of delivering what's termed a sustainable and resilient transport function, given the resources that are available. But of course, if you look under the surface, the level of ambition has been carefully tailored in order to match the resources that are available. And so if we go back to the original question, which is this enough, and what are the medium-term consequences of this? The answer is that we on the material we've got, we can't possibly know. You know, I know from an anecdotal basis the tube is much more reliable now than it was when I moved to London in the 1980s. But we don't seem to have available good material that assesses the state of repair and the likely forward reliability of the tube and its different performance measures, and some sense about whether the prospective capital investment is going to improve, sustain, or be inadequate to meet those purposes. So I think I would turn the question back and say it's not possible on the basis of the material we have to be definitive on this, but what would you need to know in order to be more confident that you can be at the moment?
Okay, so there's more performance information required to assure us that it is sustainable. What's your take, looking at, you know, how capital investment perhaps works in other cities, on this issue, the government trying to really push in terms of financial sustainability, trying to push enhancements, capital enhancements, as something that TfL should somehow be funding out of its main core budgets?
Well, I mean, I think we know from, there was an excellent piece of work done by Moody's, the rating agency, a couple of years ago, which compared London's public transport system, but particularly the Underground, with its analogues in New York and Paris. And we know that London's system is far more fare dependent. It runs itself requiring a far larger proportion of its day-to-day spending is funded, in fact most of its day-to-day spending, possibly all, is funded via day-to-day income, which is remarkable by international standards. And of course, financial sustainability obviously is enhanced the nearer TfL could get to funding all of its own activities out of its own income, because then, apart from something like the pandemic, which is a one-off, let's hope, the greater freedom it has, the more it can generate its own resources. And that's the argument, of course, for looking more widely, raising a much bigger subject, at ways that London government, the GLA, can be made more financially autonomous over time.
Absolutely, and that goes back to the two commissions that you chair, which I think are still really relevant, and I hope maybe we can, as an Assembly, be pushing again in the future. Alfie, do you want to come in on this issue of TfL's capital programme and how sustainable it is with the settlement it received from government?
I don't think to add on the capital programme, but I don't know if you were going to go on to other elements of fares or...
Yeah, I'm going to go on to fares. So if you want to then segue into fares, just wondering your thoughts then on the Mayor's planned fares increase. He stressed this morning 4% is assumed, but we know 4.9 is national. Pushed him on whether he might be looking to differentiate or not between different modes. If you want to talk about capital and move into that.
I mean, I think that, I think in fairness to the conversation we had earlier around the extent to which this is an exceptional year or not, is every year exceptional year, actually I think the extent to which that is used as a factor in planning out long-term capital spending should be regarded critically, because in the end that should be a long-term plan and particularly on housing, where as I think as everyone here has talked about, we've got a housing crisis that has evolved and manifested in different ways, but multiple times over the last 20, 30 years. And so you really can't talk about one-off events affecting the capital programme. Similar for TfL. I think that when it comes to fares, you do have this question of in terms of the external environment that we're playing into. And I think that the points that have been raised over the course of this conversation around, exceptionalism of one year to the next, about thinking about the budget across time and thinking about outcome metrics, they all crystallize, I think, around, or one way in which all three of those crystallizes around policies that pertain to how do you use reserves? How do you use reserve spending? When should you use them? Because, of course, reserves in perpetuity. If that was the case, then that would be a poor use of reserves. But the question is, when do they get deployed, and for what reason, and against what sort of judgment of the cycle they're trying to smooth? And I think one of the key levers is fares if you're going to do that sort of thing. And so, whether 4% is right or wrong depends upon obviously a judgment of the affordability and the challenges being faced by Londoners in terms of cost of living crisis. I would say that given the remarks I made earlier on, that actually the situation could be more acute than previously feared. Fares may not be doing enough, but the question then becomes, well, what lower percentage could you tolerate, and through what sort of reserves policy would be appropriate to deliver that, which we just don't have at our disposal. So I want to the next point around, I do think these issues around timeliness, outcome metrics, exceptionalism do really crystallise around how the appropriate use of reserves, and that comes to bear, I think, through levers like fares.
Lovely, thank you. Stuart, do you want to comment on fares, the Mayor's planned fare increase, and any thoughts you have on this and the impact on Londoners?
I might say something more specifically on the use of reserves. It's very difficult to second guess a reserve strategy from outside an organisation. Essentially, there are no specific technical thresholds for public bodies that you need to pass. It's a risk assessment, in particular by the finance function, and it's certainly a source of frustration for central government ministers that, in terms of crisis, local authorities' reserves tend to increase, which to them seems counterintuitive, but that's because the finance functions in the individual authorities perceive higher levels of risk and are insuring against that risk by building reserves. As far as the level of fares that's imposed from March, there's a great deal of politics about that. It will be just before the election, of course, and we're in the midst still of the cost of living crisis, so there's an affordability issue for individual fare pairs. We haven't talked as much about dynamic fare increases as we touched on the last time. I noticed this morning the Mayor was quite cautious on that, and there will be some significant issues of practicability and indeed of the notice that's given to people who might end up paying more for travelling at particular times of year than they've been doing at the moment. So maybe that's an issue for future years, but it certainly is something that, from an economic standpoint, you feel that there can be a better match between the ability to pay and the fares that are charged at given times of the year or at different points in the week.
Yeah, I think that's right. And from our meeting with the Commissioner before Christmas, it was quite clear they've been doing a bit of work around dynamic pricing, but it certainly wasn't going to be a priority this year. And the Mayor, I kind of got that impression as well this morning. Tony, have you got anything to add on fares and what the Mayor said earlier?
I think there's always a temptation an understandable temptation to moderate fare incomes at fare levels in order to protect individuals with lower incomes. And I think that the difficulty about that is, rather than linking fares to inflation or earnings even, is that over time, the organisation risks becoming less financially sustainable and independent. But then the issue is, if fares do go up in line with inflation or earnings or a mixture of the two over time, how are lower income households protected? Interesting, I came here on the Elizabeth line this morning, premium service, exactly the same price, all built into the fare structure for obvious reasons. We all like the ease of use of the fare structure. And of course, then we're left with issues like, and the Mayor did touch on this, how to ensure that the forms of transport that are most used by lower income households are perhaps somewhat more protected than those that tend to be used by higher income households. And that's been a sort of tube versus buses balance for a number of years. And seems to me, given the premium service offered by railways, and certainly new railways, that's probably a sensible place to look over time. But I do think that it's incumbent on, TfL, the GLA, to ensure that fare income rises over time and broadly in line with the economy, at least, because otherwise, there's, the sustainability argument is lost. I'm going back to the issue of post-pandemic. I mean, what's interesting, I looked at, in preparing for today, at what's happened to season tickets on the National Railway, and season ticket use has collapsed. And that suggests that the morning commute, or morning and evening commute, we know this is a bigger issue to do with working from home, which I know the Assembly's also been looking at. It means that the old method of setting prices, which assumed there was a rush hour, isn't going to work as well, and that then means looking at fares across the day and across the week, which I think means shifting the burden of fares somewhat towards what used to be called leisure time and away from what used to be called peak hours over time. That's what the message seems to me coming out of changing usage patterns on the tube in particular over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's where fares will be going forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just on the unfairness, I feel duty bound to point out there's some geographic unfairness with access to lovely tube trains as well. 500,000 people in Croydon and Sutton that I represent. It's a distant mirage, this tube thing that we sometimes hear about down in South London. On the season ticket collapse, by the way, the railway companies have told us that creates not only a revenue problem, it creates a revenue certainty problem, of course, because they swap long-term certainty of revenue of people who bought the season ticket up front with lots of people like me turning up each day and buying a ticket when they need a ticket and not buying one when they don't want one. So it's a big risk as well as a revenue cost. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm delighted that Tony was able to travel using a premium service this morning, because also being from southwest London, I was able to use the not premium service of the Northern Line, which we thought that at one point that there might be Crossrail 2 running north and south. We used to call the Elizabeth Line Crossrail 1 back in the day. So it's lovely to know that there is this beautiful line that's completely inaccessible both to Assembly Member Garrett and myself. Maybe one day we will improve things for southwest, possibly even southeast London, who knows. But I actually didn't want to talk about fares or the premium service on a day-to-day basis. I actually just wanted to come back to the point about the sort of very short-term settlements and the consequences of that in terms of uncertainty, which the Chair was just referring to. The government itself addressed the inefficiency of short-term funding in the Department of Transport's 2013 paper, so this is not a new issue, which was called Action on Roads, which stated that certainty will enable savings of up to 20% on maintenance and improvement work. And in the minutes of the TfL board meeting on the 29th of March last year, it said the government recognises the benefits of long-term funding certainty that it brings for transport in terms of value for money for the taxpayer, and has now decided to provide 8 regions outside of London with London-style long-term transport investment settlements. A second phase was announced, which extended them by a further 5 years to March 2032, and gave those regions the certainty and the long-term planning horizon to tackle key strategic challenges, optimise asset replacement, innovate with their supply chain, and drive value for money. Now, the government reckons 20%, but the Railway Industry Association reckons that there's a 30% increase in the costs if you go for these very short-term settlements. And I just wondered if you would agree how much that benefit could be. I mean, would you agree with that sort of quantification at 20 or 30%? I'll maybe start with Stuart and then come to Tony Travers.
I strongly agree with the need for more medium and long-term settlements. I can't possibly put a figure on it for individual parts of the public economy, but it seems clear that the gains are potentially very large, and they're large not just in terms of a knowledge of the future financial profile, but also on perceptions of risk in operations. And it's probably also worth remembering that the uncertainty lies not just in the knowledge of future finance allocations, but also in the future policy framework. So if we think, for example, of adult social care, which I know is not a GLA responsibility, the debate on that has swung backwards and forwards for a number of years. And there is as yet no forward framework on that. So certainty is required on the forward policy framework as well as on the finance framework, and the potential gains are significant on this.
Thank you. I'll just come to you, Tony, and obviously one of the other points about this, apart from sort of like the potential cost of money going down, if you've got that sort of forward plan for 5 years, but there's also the issues, I think, about supply chain and that lack of certainty that might make prices of things that you actually want to purchase more difficult to spread over 5 years and, more expensive.
Well, just to comment on your opening remarks and from the chair about what Crossrail 2. There's no doubt that had there been in a kind of fantasy world, Crossrail 1 delivered and then Crossrail 2 starting, then the workforce and the expertise would all have been protected and preserved and could have been used seamlessly to go from one to the other.
I mean, just imagine.
And just imagine, and I totally agree about the relative difference between, the standards of some railway provision in South and South East and South West London compared with the Underground, so I get that point utterly, totally. So like I said, we can't put a number on it, but self-evidently, common sense suggests that if there is consistency of planning and the capacity to move people from one project to another, that is going to reduce the costs of maintaining railways, housing, whatever. And the UK as a whole is famously now way out of line in terms of building transport infrastructure and their costs. Nothing to do with London, it's the UK as a whole, not mentioning HS2, well I have just mentioned HS2, which itself brings a lot of uncertainty, for this budget to do with what's going to happen at Old Oak Common, for example. That's a massive level of uncertainty, which I suspect the budget for Old Oak Common may need to reflect running forward. So I take the point entirely. It's axiomatic to be true, but and in fairness to the current government, I mean, short-termism didn't start with the current government. In fairness, it's an inevitable way of behaving, given the very short-term nature of UK budgeting and financial planning, and it's not unique to this government. It is, in this country.
Thank you. I don't know whether you want to come in on this element, Alfie, as well, or...
No, I agree with what's been said in terms of the benefits of long-term planning.
Thanks. I just wanted to put a further point to Stuart and Tony, which is from the Centre for London, who have published in September policy priorities for transport in London. And I'm just going to read something again from there. And their recommendation to the UK government is to enable the Mayor of London to improve transport in London. The UK government should give the Mayor of London and boroughs new powers to raise funds themselves for the delivery of sustainable transport measures, such as improvements to public transport or the introduction of new bike and walking routes. until new fundraising powers are introduced, the government should make funding available to local authorities and Transport for London so that they can make transport in London greener and fairer, engage residents meaningfully over changes to what's on offer, and support those who are most impacted with complementary measures. This could also enable TfL to work closely with the private sector to develop innovative solutions that make it easier for Londoners to easily use multimodal transport options, which I'm sure actually almost everybody will have used this morning. To boost the capital's economy through improved transport links, the UK government should freeze public transport fares until inflation has returned to its target level as a way of helping people with the cost of living crisis. Now, leaving that final point from the centre of London to one side, what do you think of the idea of additional fundraising powers for the GLA and also for the boroughs? I think it's interesting that they've said here that might assist with innovative solutions to some of London's problems and to really start to sort of motor forward, including involving people in the decisions about the changes we might make. I'll start with Stuart again.
I'm sure we would all support the aspirations that you've outlined in terms of the practical outcomes, but it takes us immediately into the policy debate around fiscal devolution, which authorities all over the country are interested in, whether it's tourist taxes or assigned levels of VAT in particular areas. And historically, central governments of successive administrations have been very, very nervous about this. Nervousness stemming directly from the Treasury, which counts a pound raised locally through council tax or other forms of fiscal devolution as equivalent to a pound spent in central government, and worries about the overall level of control over public expenditure. And until we can get over that hump and closer to a position that we see in other countries, we're unlikely to see any significant fiscal devolution, or certainly not unconstrained devolution. But it is an issue that won't go away. It impacts very strongly on the buoyancy of income for authorities more generally, which is what I think the report is indirectly getting at, and will be of continuing interest to a whole range of bodies. But so far, despite a lot of dialogue on this, we've seen absolutely no progress whatsoever.
Well, as Tony knows, this body itself it is interested in fiscal and other forms of devolution, because our oversight committee last year invited Tony in as an expert guest, and we've just produced our own report on this matter. I don't know whether you want to comment on the piece that I just read from the Centre for London, Tony.
I think Stuart's admirably summarised the challenge, which is, in a country now which is widely seen by most people in most parties as overtaxed, tax burden is higher than it's been for decades. Proposing more taxes is, does seem risks of straws and camels' backs and all of that. So I think it's an admirable aspiration, and the kind of policies you're outlining, not always totally agreed, but many people would agree with them. I think the time may have come, and this takes us off into an entirely different direction, so I'll only say it briefly. There are things to do with transport infrastructure, particularly roads infrastructure in the city, which probably could benefit from a way of trying to raise money from those who cause the destruction of road quality. So I think
degradation.
I think that levies on the utilities, not just TfL has these powers at the moment, but the boroughs don't, to try to improve the quality of roads. One of the few things that motorists and cyclists agree about is somewhere where I think the utilities, in a sense, ought to pay, because they cause so many of the problems if you look at the roads.
Maybe this is another version of extended producer responsibility, in the sense of people who are producing the problems should be paying for this.
It's the polluter pays principle.
Yeah. Can I just finally ask, do you think there are any benefits to the government providing TfL with capital funding deals that are half what have been requested 4 months before the start of the new financial year? Can you see any benefits to that at all?
Well, I think if I can't speak for all of us, I think our answers have sort of covered that already. I mean, bidding processes presumably involve one side asking for a bit more than it wants and the other giving it a bit less than than is asked for. So I don't know exactly what the numbers are and how far TfL's finances were compromised. It's impossible to see that from the outside. But we're back to the short-termism problem, and we can all agree short-termism is not a good thing.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Just I realise it's slightly straying beyond transport, but it's an interesting point you brought up about fiscal devolution. This is something I've considered. You make the point that if you give local authorities, regional authorities, new tax-raising powers, that's new taxes, higher tax burden, not necessarily very popular. So then you think about how you make that revenue neutral. You'd have to reduce some central tax in order to increase that. But then you get into the problem of a government, any government, this one, some future hypothetical one, passing a law that reduces its own powers and reduces its own tax-raising powers and gives it to somebody else which may not be of the same political persuasion. So you can see the challenge there, whoever is occupying whatever spot in that chessboard. So has that ever been done? Because it seems to me that if you can't overcome that structural kind of game theoretical problem, you never get fiscal devolution, you just keep talking about it. Has that ever been done, or is there a theoretical process of how it could be done that could be achieved?
So I was involved in the design of the original landfill tax. And at the time, the proceeds for that, at least in the first wave of implementation, were used to reduce national insurance contributions. So the idea was that by introducing a tax on a bad, which was environmental pollution, we could reduce the tax on a good, which was labour and employment. One of the key issues in doing that, though, those were both central government taxes. When you talk about fiscal devolution, you have to be acutely conscious of where the accountability lies. And unless you can shift the accountability to the local level, which, as a byword, we haven't even really seen in council tax. Central government still feels acutely accountable for the overall levels of council tax that individual local authorities decide on within constraints. Unless you can shift that accountability to the person introducing and levying the tax, then central government will always be reluctant to take action, because they'll always fear there's a kind of backlash at the national level.
Yes, Tony.
I mean, to answer your question directly, what you ask did happen when Scottish and Welsh devolution took place. So Scotland and Wales, but most particularly Scotland, were given initial tax-raising powers and then wider tax-raising powers, and the Barnett formula was adjusted to ensure that neither Scotland or Wales were worse or better off. So it can be done, but you don't have to have been in the Treasury at the time to imagine the degree of angst that it will have induced there, because they will see this as losing control. But it can be done mathematically, and of course the Assembly Member Cooper mentioned the fact that the West Midlands and Greater Manchester in particular are now being given certainty in their transport funding. So again, the idea of a sort of early stage, sort of on the way to a Barnett formula protection over time for certain parts of city regional funding there is also a precedent for that.
Okay, thank you. Apologies, I shouldn't dwell on that too long, because that was slightly off topic of transport, but it had come up and I thought it was a very interesting question while we had you here. So we're now, I don't see any indications on transport, so we'll move on to our next section, which is police, which I will start. So obviously the interesting thing this year, which I asked the Mayor about earlier, and you may have, I'm asking now your thoughts on, this idea of the Met Police effectively presenting two budgets. I spent about, feels like an hour yesterday trying to get to the bottom of it with them, what their thinking was and what the difference was. But essentially we have what we were calling Annex 1 and Annex 2. So one that the Mayor has incorporated within the GLA group, and another one that was about another £140 million, which is substantially about extra 1,000 staff and funding the new Met for London. So I'm not saying asking you for the detail on that. I feel like we spent a lot of time with the Met on the detail. But in principle, this idea about one of the bodies presenting 2, 3, 10, a menu of possible budgets to the sort of central GLA. What your thoughts are on that approach? So who wants to kick off? Stuart, I see you're hovering over the mic button.
Okay, so I think I touched on this earlier. Clearly, budget setting in any organisation takes place within a political context, particularly for a politically led organisation. And so you understand why people say and do the things they do at different points in the process. But it seems to me it's not entirely helpful to present a budget which is missing two of the most important components of what the eventual outcome will be, which is the cultural change on the back of the review from Baroness Casey and the thinking around extra manpower numbers. And I appreciate there are continuing uncertainties, particularly on the second of those in relation to the Home Office and the extra money that the Commissioner has asked for, and when Southampton Papers hasn't had a response to yet. But framing a position which is all or nothing is not necessarily the most helpful thing, at least from an external perspective and perhaps from the committee's perspective. I'm sure internally there's a much clearer idea in the police function as well as in the GLA centrally about what the likely outcome is, and that it lies somewhere between those on Scrivener's two extremes.
Yeah, I suppose to be fair, normally we only ever get one budget, so it's less all or nothing than that. And actually, I should say they were at pains to express to me when I pressed them on the point you've just made about whether not doing the extra 140 million means ditching the new Met for London plan, and they were very keen that to be clear that it didn't. It just probably meant stretching it out over a longer period of time or something of that ilk.
Exactly.
But, yeah. Tony.
I mean, I suppose the question asked is a really interesting one because of the structural nature, which we've already referred to, of this document, which to some extent is bolting together, TfL, which is half of the GLA's gross budget, more than half actually, with the capital, and the Metropolitan Police, which is a substantial chunk as well. Because both the Met and TfL London Transport, for decades, were freestanding institutions with their own way of thinking, their own culture. When the Metropolitan Police was first brought into the GLA group in 2000, it's had antiquated accounting methods which hadn't really changed since Sir Robert Peel. So it's much improved since then. So I think that these very large organisations, particularly those that were traditionally very independent, I think will always find it that they're going to budget in their own way, they have their own culture, which is very strong. And so I think that the challenge for City Hall, be it both the Mayor and for the Assembly, is to bring these institutions into a common, comprehensible budgetary process which they are genuinely a part of. And I think that's the problem that you're rightly outlining. It's going to require negotiation, I think, involving both the Assembly and MOPAC and the Mayor, because it's in all their interests to have a consistent process where the document that's published at this time of year genuinely is a comprehensive budgetary process, not bolting together separate institutions, separate plans, and trying through accountancy to present them in a consistent way.
Yeah, I think you have put your finger on the difference between the GLA and probably any other public body in existence. So more of a sort of close-flying formation of different things rather than a one single thing.
And I know Stuart will know more about this, but it's not completely dissimilar to central government. Talk to people in Downing Street, in any administration, and they sort of slightly roll their eyes when they talk about big departments, because once they've been given their spending settlements, the Secretary of State in that department has absolute power over the way the money, well, Stuart's now shaking his head, but significant power, which is very hard for Downing Street or the Treasury to control between, once the money's been handed to them.
You wanted to come back into it. I'm keen to talk to Alfie as well, but did you want to...
No, I wasn't going to disagree. Sometimes described as rubber levers, where the action at the centre doesn't always translate fully into delivery in individual departments. But what I was going to mention, well, first of all, just to record from the papers that I think the Mayor has made steps to improve the oversight of the Met in the past year, but also to say that the budget also gives a sense that there are significant efficiency savings planned, but not necessarily nailed down in full detail, and in some cases actually may result in changes or reductions in services within the function. And again, that's not clearly specified at this stage, and takes us back to the kind of outcome measures that we talked about earlier. Thank you.
Okay, I actually was going to ask about outcome measures next, so hold that thought. Alfie, did you have any thoughts on either the Met budget overall or this general approach of presenting, option A or option B?
Yeah, just a comment on that overall approach. I think in principle it is a good thing to have information that shows a bit of the workings or the negotiating positions that sit behind some of the decisions and allocations that are made, because I mean a good thing in terms of holding a process to account. So the job that we're doing here and that you're doing, and whether it's good for the Mayor or not, I think that's the second question, but I think it is good for this process to have that sort of information, because it sets out the range of, if you like, the counterfactual for where the budget could have ended up and didn't, based on the trade-offs and judgments that were made. And that is very useful information, I think, in terms of the parameters to options that are decided. But to Stuart's point, I think it becomes unhelpful if it comes at the expense of prolonged uncertainty over what the core estimate is. So yes, you might have a bit more information about counterfactuals and positions going into the process, but if it comes at the expense of not knowing where things are landing until a deferred point in time, that's a problem for accountability and holding to a process. So I think in principle it's a good thing, but it shouldn't come at the cost of having a core estimate as early as possible alongside that.
That's very true. Yeah, we spend a lot of time in this committee saying, what would you do if you had some extra money? And I suppose this does answer that question, because otherwise that question never gets answered, not directly. In terms of performance then, so let's imagine the extra money, let's imagine we end up with Annex 2, which is the extra money, the wish list budget, if you like, from the Met Commissioner. And then perhaps if you were the Mayor, you might want some accountability for the extra money that's going in. What are your thoughts on the kinds of accountability, the kinds of measures? This has come up a lot this morning about what sort of output-based measures would be good to try and build in as a quid pro quo, if you like, in that process. I don't know. You sort of started to hint at that earlier, Stuart, and Tony, you were just nodding thoughtfully. So I don't know which of you is most eager to. Stuart,
I'll give it a go. There is a clear statement of priorities for the function within the material that we've seen, and so the first challenge is to devise clear and realistic measures for the outputs and outcomes that are tied to those priorities. But there's also a very interesting theme in the papers now, which is cultural change, which we would all agree is a substantial priority. Likely for all police authorities across the country, but certainly for the Met, and so accessing those more intangible and informal and perception-based outcomes is also clearly very, very important.
Yeah, you're right. That is, of course, a bigger part of what the new Met for London plan is about, and that's a very good point. Tony.
Well, I mean, this is a rich theme because, quite rightly, you challenged me, having said, what about what do I suggest, performance and outcomes report, what might be in it? And in fairness to TfL, if their business plan does include a certain amount of this already, if you look at the business plan they published recently, they do have forward figures for fare revenue, for customer satisfaction, passenger satisfaction, and so on. So there are some in there. When Michael Bloomberg was Mayor of New York City, he had an office devoted to not targets so much as to consistent data over time that made it possible to judge whether, to take an obviously very difficult one, whether crime is going up or down. You only have to say crime is going up or down, and it's particularly in election year, to know how easy it is to choose time series, to choose indicators and whatever. And it's just, and it's not unique to this year and the election. It happens all the time. Government and opposition do this. So I think what one would be looking for in principles is a relatively small number of comprehensible measures which were consistent over time and independently verified. That's the kind of thing that in general. And so, and I'm not a great believer in targets, but I do think common sense, and most members of the public would suggest that crime going down and passenger numbers going up was a kind of, providing the measures were good ones, the kind of thing you'd expect to happen. Intermediate measures like numbers of police officers, I think personally, are less important than whether those police officers deliver value for money or whether the transport system delivers value for money. And going back to the debate you had earlier this morning with the Mayor about, where money comes from for particular purposes, I mean, I do think it's in everybody's interest that those questions can be answered, and I think transparency, and Stuart made this point earlier, I totally agree with it, is essential in terms of trust of public institutions, not just this one.
Yeah, that's a very good point about final public-facing outcomes, not intermediate measures. I think it's very easy to get caught up in those in all words. That's a very good point. Alfie, did you have anything on this question about outputs, specifically in relation to the Met?
Not in relation to the Met. I was going to make the same point that Tony made in terms of the importance of an independent and consistent metric, whatever is used, because otherwise you end up in a situation where the current, if you like, obfuscation from not having metrics at all just gets pushed into the choice of metrics, the choice of baseline, and the change of those from across time. If the homework is being marked by the same people who are doing it, so it's critical that those metrics are independent, whatever that final menu is.
Yes, I think that's a very good. I made a note of that. In actual fact, going to our outputs, I think that's a very important point. Sticking with this theme of the Met Police, I now have Assembly Member Pigeon.
Just quickly, one of the big discussions we had yesterday and this morning was around the Met estate, and MOPAC and the Met are really facing challenges in terms of managing and maintaining their estate. We've got a long awaited estate strategy which will emerge at some point after the election, but I'm just wondering if any of the guests have any thoughts on what the Met and MOPAC should be doing in terms of prioritising their estate and the budgetary pressures here. Tony.
I mean, it's again, like so many of these things, quite hard from a standing start to give a helpful comment, because, but this takes us towards the answer, I think. I'm not sure I would know where to go, and others may do, to find what the existing Metropolitan Police estate is, and how much of it was being used efficiently and how much of it wasn't. I'm aware, anecdotally, and we have to use a certain amount of data in all of this, of unused police stations around London, and then you yourself were questioning the Mayor earlier about potentially about to be closed or differently used police stations. So I think, and it goes beyond buildings, I mean, estate is a much broader concept, I understand. So one of the things that it would be most helpful, it seems to me, from this committee's point of view and from Londoners' point of view, is if we had more information about the estates of all the GLA's functional body and what they were being used for. And one would have thought that a private company would do that. If you were a big supermarket, you would know which of your shops were open or which weren't, and which were selling things and which were turning a profit. So I think the more transparency there is, we're back to that word, in the estate of various functional bodies, the easier it would be for this committee to have a debate with those who are more expert than I am about whether the estate is being effectively used.
Stuart, do you have anything on this?
Nothing specific, except to say that it's clearly very important for all major public bodies to have clear strategies and plans in relation to the major inputs that underpin their efforts, and the Met Estate is a strong example of that. And there's also, I think, some interesting opportunities here for using the estate in ways that connect to the community and are shared with other public service and community organisations, and I would hope the estate strategy says something about that again, finally, it takes us back to the issue of targets, which I'm personally, I would say I'm a strong believer in, because I think they influence the direction and the resources within organisations, but they do need to be framed properly and reported in the right way, and do everything they can to avoid perverse incentives. Thanks.
Thank you. And Alfie, anything on that?
Nothing further to add from me.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Unbeknownst to you, Caroline, Tony was just indicating.
Just to add one final thought. On the 18th of December, Michael Gove, DLUX Secretary, put out a consultation about, quite a surprising consultation, about the possibility of allowing local authorities to sell off capital assets to use them to fund revenue spending, which is a very interesting portal to be opening, indeed, in my view. But it's germane to the discussion that we're having, because the GLA, I'm sure, owns substantial amounts of estate and assets, as do councils. And this is clearly seen, I'm surprised to say, by the Treasury as a way of relieving the pressure on municipal and indeed GLA budgets. So I think it's probably worth looking at that and how it might apply to the GLA bodies. Assuming the government goes ahead with it.
When did that come out, Tony?
It came out on the 18th of December. Always a popular day.
Yeah, missed it. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
I think that was news to us. As a reminder, of course, that sustainability comes in many forms, which is segueing perfectly onto our next section, which is Assembly Member Russell, looking at green finance and climate budgeting.
Thank you. And actually, just picking up on that point that you were making, Tony, we heard very loud and clear this morning that revenue funding has to be recurring funding. So if you get into a strategy of selling off assets, you get to a point where you get into a really deep hole, because you've got yourself committed to recurring funding. And so it just sort of feels like it's something that's pretty dangerous for
I've said I was surprised, but in fact, for those authorities that have issued Section 114 notices, including Croydon, one of the things commissioners, when they're sent in, or review teams can allow, and indeed this is happening in Birmingham as well, can allow, as a short-term measure, councils to sell off assets to bring down that deficit, which is the beginning of this process. So I agree with you. I think it's an extraordinary move, but it's definitely been announced. It's in consultation, and it definitely looks like a way DLUC would like to go forward. But I take your point.
Yes.
I agree. It was a surprising and strangely low-key consultation. It's a little bit of a step back from firm proposals. It's a number of ideas just put on the table with no timescales for implementation. So there's no immediate remedy arising there, and all of the proposals will increase capital expenditure. The one way in which that can be used on a more sustainable basis is to fund the upfront costs of transformation. And I think that's one of the angles it's coming from. You're absolutely right, of course. Entering into commitments with recurring revenue expenditure on the interfaces would not be sustainable. But the thinking behind it, I think, is that there's a payback within a given time, which makes it more fiscally neutral. Right. But an unusual departure.
Indeed. I'm going to move on to the issue of climate budgeting, though. So we were discussing just earlier, the Green Finance Fund has got a fairly significant chunk of the it's got 190 million from the UK Infrastructure Bank. So it seems that they are kind of busy now allocating funding, and it seems like they've got the beginnings of a pipeline. We heard about 6 new bids which have just come in and haven't yet been assessed, but also that they've got a pipeline of projects that are now and projects not just from GLA Group, who are kind of part of the GLA family, but also from wider public sector organisations in London. So that seems, all so far so good. So what I'm just wondering is, do you have, and I'm going to start with Alfie, do you have views about how to ensure that this Green Finance Fund is used really to the most effect to deliver the most change and benefit for London in terms of reducing carbon emissions and avoiding any tick box exercises, which I think were warned about by Tom Pope in our earlier meeting with you, and also avoiding funding any projects that might have been funded anyway. So, Alfie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the critical question, and it comes back to a theme we talked about a lot, which is the quality of precision and independence of the metrics we use to judge these things, by the data we have to appraise against those metrics. I think it's just another example of that. I think that possibly the biggest trap, if you like, for an exercise like this is to ask the wrong exam question from the outset. So I think the financial sustainability of the fund and the operation is obviously important for the longevity and scale that it can operate at, but it is not the ultimate goal of the fund. So in the end, it's supposed to be about taking on financial risk in order to unearth good projects that the private sector would not have otherwise had the appetite to invest in. And that means effectively you're internalising our financial risk into the exercise, which means it's a challenge to its own financial planning and outlook. So I think often, because the easiest thing to measure is, well, how much money have we got, how much have we got coming in, what does our balance sheet look like, does it look healthy? Those are things you can measure very easily because they're endogenous to the process, and it's become, when there should be intermediate goals, they sort of replace what we should actually be aiming for, which is unearthed in a way that doesn't incur deadweight loss because they would not have been invested anyway. So I think the main thing I flag is to avoid that trap and to stick to the harder job of identifying external metrics, identifying deadweight loss or otherwise, and not being too preoccupied with the financial performance in a narrow sense of the exercise itself.
So you mean to be more focused on the outcomes in terms of reducing carbon emissions and actually kind of taking that work into areas where it wouldn't have happened otherwise, and to kind of count that benefit in terms of London reducing its overall carbon emissions rather than focusing narrowly on finances.
There's almost three steps, I think, pretty crudely. There's the kind of the end point, which is, are we producing less carbon as a result of projects that are now up and running? There's an intermediate measurement, which is, did projects happen that would have not otherwise have happened because of the risk-bearing properties of this fund? And then there's the sort of narrow question, which is the financial performance of this fund in terms of pure returns on investments, number of investments, failures, successes, etc. And if you like, those are the three, if you like, steps of metrics. And I think the final one of those, the narrow one, is the least important, actually. It's a necessary one to enable the other two, but the real risk is it ends up, because it's the easiest to measure, it becomes the one that is looked at most closely and most attention is given to, rather than the other two.
Okay, so make sure that attention is given to the carbon and the fact that projects are happening that wouldn't otherwise have happened, and make sure that's held solidly in the metrics. It'd be useful for us to potentially recommend that to the Mayor. Turning to everyone in the room, so shall I go to Stuart, then Tony? Do you want to come back on that question?
Yes, please. So the first thing I want to say is I think that's exactly right, the kind of framework that Alfie laid out. On one hand, the opportunities here are considerable for the GLA, not just in framing the narrative and piloting the practical tools, which you can do because it operates at scale, but also to become a leading organisation in the public sector, in the UK and beyond. The opportunities are, I think, considerable, because it says we're at quite an early stage in the market in these using these tools, and so there is low-hanging fruit available. There ought to be schemes that pass with flying colours, the kind of framework that Alfie outlined. But care is needed in the assessment techniques to ensure that we don't enter into things that are unsustainable, or offer poor value for money for the limited funds that are available, or end up funding substantial derivate costs because they would have happened in any case. So having an eye to avoiding those things is important, and the analytical tools, I think, are becoming available that allow you to make that assessment. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tony?
Well, we've sort of touched on this earlier on with the general discussion we were having about performance, because it seems to me, I mean, as Stuart said earlier, there are threaded through this budget document a number of observations about historic and projected emissions reductions. There's a chart on page 23, which I've got open here. And in the text under that, there are implied policy changes or policy directional changes which could be turned into more specific. I said I'm less enthusiastic than Stuart about targets, but path of change figures. So for it says TfL will invest around 350 million over the next 3 years to decarbonise its operations, and plans, interesting word, to source 100% of its electricity from renewable sources by 2030. Is that going to go down in a straight line? Or is it going to go down in a step at the end? Or go down a lot, in a sense? So data about how policy objectives in this sphere, but it could apply to others, are to be achieved. And then I think it would also be helpful to know, what the GLA is doing beyond its own activities to be an exemplar and to promote good practice, which would also be stated and measured. So I think we are definitely back in the world of needing ways of assessing what the 190 million or whatever the number of millions of pounds is being used, and what the outcomes of that will be, and a path for you as an assembly, a committee, a performance committee, to be able to assess what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so actually for us to get some clear indication from the mayor's teams about how the assessments are made and the weight given to the less carbon actually making projects happen, and then the financial performance would actually be really helpful in terms of analysis
and it would
of
allow
progress over time.
And it would allow this committee then to monitor performance over time, which seems to me the purpose of having such measures in this committee.
Yep, thank you. So my next question is more about Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. So when climate budgeting was first brought in, they were just looking at Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for the GLA group alone, and that was for the year 23-24 that we're kind of currently sitting in. What we were expecting for this year was London Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which is the emissions that are physically produced in London, like gas boilers in our homes, or the emissions associated with consumption in London of grid-supplied electricity. Now, they've, I think, been very candid with us and have said that their plans to start measuring and tracking their progress on reducing Scope 3 emissions is clearly being it was meant to come in next year, but is being shunted off into the future because, and they've given us some very reasonable reasons for doing that. Oslo took 7 years to get to Scope 3 emissions, and it's much better that they do this work properly and thoroughly than that they try and pull the wool over our eyes and say they're doing it when they're actually not. So I think that candour is really helpful. However, there are still some questions to be asked about this. And for instance, in the kind of spreadsheets that they provide for their climate budgeting. They have, for level 1, they have funded and unfunded projects mentioned, which means they've got a pipeline for scope 1. For scope 2, there's funded projects, which are the things that they're actually doing, but there's nothing unfunded. So that suggests that there's possibly no actual pipeline. So I just wonder broadly, kind of whether you've got any views really on the sort of the feasibility and challenges of implementing the Mayor's climate budgeting in relation to that, and also the point that the police don't have any scope 2 projects even in the funded category. So if I start with Tony this time.
I mean, as with earlier answers we have sort of given, it seems to me that in order to be able fairly and accurately to assess progress, so with the projects of different types, it's essential, it seems to me, that there's published information and the Assembly has access to what each of these projects is supposed to achieve and what their impact on emissions would be. I mean, whether is the I can't answer the question. You will know much more than I do as to whether what the criteria are which are being used to decide between these projects, and whether it is scale of immediate delivery or scale of long-term delivery and so on. So again, we're back to the issue of I think needing to know what the objectives are that lie behind in individual decision making, in order that those who are holding the Mayor to account can assess whether the progress is appropriate and fast enough. So I can't kind of make that judgment because I don't have that information, but it seems to be without that, it's very hard for anybody fully to hold the process to account.
So it's clarity about the measuring of the projects. Once again.
And what the projects are expected to deliver in a way that is to some extent quantifiable, because the risk of doing things that make people feel good as compared with those that deliver outcomes is present in all spheres of public life, and this is not excluded from them.
Mm-hmm. And motivating, actually taking constructive action rather than things that look good on, making sure that the measurements kind of underpin good work that really does the job and gets the outcomes required.
Yeah. And motivation being most important, because otherwise, people can be gripped by worry about the problem without having any sense of what solutions look like, so they can play their part in them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stuart,
I agree with that very, very much. On the face of it. And it's difficult for us to judge. From outside, the strategy appears plausible and practicable. The only note of caution I would introduce is don't let the best be the enemy of the good. And if there is low-hanging fruit, in the kind of scope 3 emissions, then don't let the wish to proceed in a thorough and measured fashion avoid taking those actions at this stage in the process. On the Scope 2 pipeline, I wonder if that's just an issue of presentation. It doesn't seem credible. There are no schemes available at this stage that offer value for money across the economic environmental appraisal. And on the police, it's very good to hear that this is being approached in an open and transparent fashion, and that kind of peer pressure that results from that and scrutiny pressure that this committee will exercise will surely help the police improve their performance in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think with the police, we also learned that obviously the estate strategy kind of actually affects some of the Scope 2 projects, so that may actually account for, that's just what we heard just earlier this morning. So, yes. Online, Alfie.
Yeah, I mean, similar thoughts. I mean, I agree with Stuart that it doesn't seem credible that there is no pipeline for Scope 2. But I think, in addition to the points that Tony made, I do wonder whether there's a problem here in terms of the stage of the process we're in, and this point about asymmetry in terms of the information that's available at this point behind the consultation documents, as opposed to the draft budget that obviously we know we're getting in days or weeks, and whether therefore there's this, in my mind, it's a corollary of points Tony was making, but it's not clear whether the absence of information at a certain level of detail is the absence of policy or just the absence of detail. And without knowing that at this point, it's very hard to offer any sort of judgment at all, I think, on that. Other than that, it would seem non-credible and a problem if it were the case there was no pipeline.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just quickly then moving on to our final section, which is the London Fire Brigade with Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. Some questions on the London Fire Brigade. I think, Stuart, I'll start with you, and also bearing in mind what you said earlier regarding reserves and it being very difficult to comment on reserve strategies from outside an organisation. I'm afraid that's exactly what I'm going to ask you to do now. London Fire Brigade's planning on drawing down quite a substantial element of their reserves. So what strategies would you recommend to address that reliance on reserves at present?
I think I'd add to that the way the budget's framed, the entirety of the allowable council tax increase within the excessiveness guidelines is devoted to the fire brigade also, from what I understand from the papers. So finance functions are acutely focused on the level of reserves and in particular on the use of reserves, and the task is to ensure that those are sustainable over time. So it very much depends on the amount of resource, the rate of drawdown, the perception of risk, both in the recent past, which of course has been a very high risk and volatile period, and looking forward, what the likely profile of drawdown in the past, and what it is that will be funded from those reserves, and as we've discussed earlier, whether those are continuing commitments or more in the way of short-term transformation and cultural change initiatives, for which the fire service has its own set of demands that it needs to answer to. I don't think I can say more than that without more detailed knowledge of the components of the budget, but I think those are the main considerations that that part of the GOA group should be having in mind. It certainly is quite striking within the budget process, the drawdown of reserves for that part of the organisation.
Okay, thank you. So are you perhaps in a position or not in a position to say whether the LFB's use of reserves is, to use your phrase, sustainable over time? Would you need more detail to make that characterisation?
Yes, okay. Exactly.
Thank you. Tony, the same question to you really. What strategies would you recommend LFB?
Well, I mean, all that's been said, I think, sort of gets there, really. Yeah. I mean, they're going to end up, according to the figures in this document, with reserves that are still, sort of 7 or 8% of the budget by 26, 27, which is not outstandingly bad. The challenge, of course, is you can only spend all of this once, and of course, the current plans here show the reduction effectively stopping in 26, 27. So there's a reduction up to 25, 26, and then a reduction. So providing the investment that this drawdown has made pays off, they'll be fine. But it's clearly, again, as Stuart said, it's hard to judge because we can't really gauge the outcomes of the way the money is being used. But if it's being used to improve the long-term sustainability of the force, then it could save money in the long term. But they'd have to convince you of that, it seems to me.
So definitely a question to revisit in future years then, to see how those investments have gone. Thank you. Going to Alfie online. Anything to add on this point, Alfie?
No, I agree with all of that. I think the only thing I'd add is, and I'm sort of forming this thought as while speaking and whilst listening. I'm not interested in what your reflection would be, but to the extent that you have a body that is more reliant on narrower income stream, in this case particularly council tax and business rates precept, and that those streams, and the reason for that is, right, it's the point we talked about earlier, which is the budget will often imply there's greater hypothecation than there actually is in practice, and there's more flexibility in the spreadsheet than the actual itemization that gets presented, and that's because you want to be able to say this, certain unpopular revenue streams are going to fund more popular spending items. But if you have a situation where more politically popular services like fire are consistently across time attributed to those more politically unpopular revenue streams, you do create, I think, situations of not perhaps absolute money problems, but problems of certainty and long-term planning, because those things like tax are the more volatile parts, in some cases the more volatile parts of the budget at the margin. And if you're consistently attributing that politically or hypothecating it politically to fire, that could affect the ability to long-term plan. So as I say, it's a thought that formed whilst listening to Tony in the question, but I'm interested in whether you think there might be anything to that.
Thank you. Sorry, was that a question for Tony? Or?
Sorry, I missed that. Repeat. Forgive me.
Yes.
No, a question, a comment, a question for the room at large. But the point was whether, if a body is particularly reliant on revenue streams that are highly visible, like in this case, essentially the business rates precept and council tax, and the reason for that is political, because they want to be able to present a popular spending item alongside a part of the budget revenue raising which is less popular, and if that is done year on year, that matching up, which is actually presentational rather than substantive, and so it needn't be the case, it could affect long-term planning decision making, because you end up with these more popular arm's length bodies being funded notionally through some less stable budget lines that are politically sensitive.
Yep.
Yes.
That's an interesting point. I mean, Tony, do you want to comment?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I was reading the fire commissioners as that point was being made. Sorry. I mean, obviously, we've bumped up against this issue earlier in a slightly different way. For TfL, the fact it has this very large fare and other revenue stream gives it a degree of autonomy, which, apart from the pandemic, which is, let's hope, a one-off, gives it, and actually the GLA to some degree, an extraordinary degree of autonomy. Whereas for other services, the more they're dependent on council tax and or grant, clearly they are much more subject to the vagaries of controls over council tax, popularity or otherwise of council tax, and government policy towards grants. And there's no doubt that the fire brigade, fire authority commissioner, are more exposed because they produce virtually no income. I mean, they're not an income generator in the way that TfL is. So the point is a good one, and I think it probably does expose the fire service slightly more over time, assuming we don't have anything else like the pandemic, to a budgetary squeeze, which TfL to some extent can avoid if it's generating its own resources.
Interesting point, thank you. One final question, I'm slightly conscious of time. It's a linked question really to the last one, but considering LFB's projected budget gaps in 25-26 and 26-27, what recommendations do you have for both the GLA and the LFB to address these gaps while ensuring that essential services are still delivered, starting perhaps with you, Stuart?
Gosh. So just quickly following on from the previous comments, accept what was said, but it's also worth recording that council tax and business rates are reasonably reliable taxes in year. They don't suffer the volatility that many other taxes suffer. And the judgment on reserves is not just a judgment on the finances that are available, it's a judgment on the demands for the service. So, the fire service will have a view as to whether their demands are generally more predictable than, for example, adult social care demands in other authorities. Reserves at the level of 6 or 7% are relatively high compared to most authorities across the country. To answer your question more directly, I think that is genuinely difficult for us to say. There is a wealth of information about the delivery of the service which is available across the country, and there's a fire service college which is devoted to improving the level of expertise and the value for money of the national service. And so as one of the very biggest players in that field, I'm sure the London Fire Service is well plugged into those national initiatives.
So you'd say that sharing best practice was an important aspect. Okay, thank you. Tony, anything to add?
I again agree with Stuart, so that's a lot today, because I have. I think it's worth noting that the Fire Brigade, probably more than any of the other services we've discussed, any of the provision we've talked about, lives in a slightly odd world where the more effective it is, the less likely it is to get funded. If there were no fires in London, we wouldn't need a fire brigade. So that's it's a perverse incentive in a way, and it's slightly complicated for the fire brigade, because they want to reduce the number of fires and ensure nobody is ever injured or dies. And of course, the more successful they are, the greater the risk that they will have their budget taken away. So it's not quite an answer to your question, but I do think it's worth seeing the fire and emergency provision not just as what it's doing in this annual way, but as something that's there when things go wrong, which occasionally in big cities they do. And so as an insurance policy, it's not quite an answer to your question. I mean, in the end, they're going to have to balance the books one way or the other, and that leaves the question of whether that does cut what is delivered, or efficiencies, or the mayor finding more money. I know it's a bit obvious, but that's where we are.
So I suppose with the fire brigade, the nature of their workload has changed significantly in recent years. So maybe is there a communication piece that they need to make sure that they're doing to remind people that they're not just there for fires, it's all kinds of other things as well, building safety, road traffic collisions, that sort of thing?
Without question. I mean, I suspect, and I'm not being critical for most of us, the fire brigade is fire engines rushing through the streets and firefighters bravely doing what they do. But of course, as with politicians and as everybody in their jobs, a lot of what they do isn't what the public sees, and deconstructing that and explaining it and, making the public feel part of, as we were discussing earlier on, part of a common endeavour, which we are, is clearly something the fire brigade probably would do for their own advantage. Yeah.
Thank you. Stuart.
But my understanding is that the number of domestic fires has fallen very much over time as people smoke less and furniture is more fire resistant. So this whole debate takes us very much into the first of all, the risk assessment. What level of service do you need, and how many fire service stations do you need across the city to provide a level of security? And second of all, what's the balance between operational response and preventative work? Which can very much add to the sort of downward pressure on day-to-day incidents in a domestic context. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, go to Alfie. Anything to add on this question, Alfie?
No, nothing better to add.
Lovely. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. I should probably say, in defence of the fire brigade who were here yesterday, they appear to have no lack of work with flooding, wildfires. Their two busiest days since the Second World War have both been in the recent few years. I think they would feel they're contractually obliged to point out. So domestic fires, as you say, is only a small part of what they do. It's not to contradict you, it's just I don't want to get letters. So we move on to our final bit, which is a sort of overall overarching question, really, from Assemblymember Harani.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll just maybe direct my questions at Alfie online from Jason from JRF, just to focus on an announcement made this morning from the Mayor on free school meals, universal free school meals, and the continuation of that into a second year. Just in terms of, from your perspective, from your organisation's perspective, what outcomes do you feel that we will see as a result of this?
I mean, the programme, as we've seen so far, and the evidence that's been available so far, is that it's positive. It has a positive impact on, as you would imagine, on the families that are in receipt, and it is a very good use of this sort of funding. But actually, this all goes back to the point I made right at the very beginning. This is probably quite an isolated example of an effective measure that does seem to have been designed commensurate with the external environment that this budget is being set within, and the problem is actually not so much in the efficacy of this intervention, which I think is good. Perhaps more could be done through this lever than is currently being done, but nonetheless, it is what is being done is effective. But the problem is it is isolated. There are not enough items in the budget with this sort of immediate objective of financial relief to Londoners, as there could have been or should have been, given the flexibility that we know there is in the budget.
Okay, could you just give a couple of examples of the kind of other options that could have come in?
So, for example, around fares, and you've got dynamic pricing, and the question of this distribution of the burden of fares is perhaps one of the single most important levers that could be pulled in response to the immediate cost of living crisis. And of course, we don't know where the mayor is going to end up at. So I'm not commenting on where the policy is by the time of the final budget, but more on the information we have so far, the ideas in circulation, and I think the conversation both with the mayor and in the consultation documents doesn't appear. Alludes to the fact, I think, that this might be an underused lever.
Okay, and just in terms of universal free school meals, what do you feel the economic benefits could be of the policy?
Well, we know that in general, that if you diminish security of a family, that has knock-on effects for the health of an economy. The two obviously run both ways, but if you deplete resources of low-income families to the degree where they're actually going hungry, the knock-on effects are both in the short term, in terms of just then reduced spending power, inability to participate in society and the economy, and the effect that has on demand, etc. But much more importantly, in the long term, educational attainment and ability to perform economic and socially is a well evidenced phenomena in terms of support at an early age.
Okay, just wanted to clarify something that you said about the examples of what else can the mayor do in terms of dynamic fare pricing. Just wanted to clarify that you meant that this is in addition to what was announced obviously this morning with universal free school meals. Not sort of, obviously the mayor has a finite pot in terms of the mayor's budget and what he's able to fund. So are you thinking more of in addition to, or do you feel the 140 million spent or projected to spend on the 1 year extension is a positive way of allocating that money?
I think that's a positive use of that money. I think it's the quantum of money going into these sorts of measures that I was commenting on, and other levers that money could go into. And fares is one example. Local childcare services and affordability is another. So it's not so much that 140 could or should have been apportioned better or differently, but I think there is not enough funding for those sorts of measures, given the dearth of, given the scale of the challenge out there and the number of different levers that could be pulled.
Okay, that's fair.
Thank you very much. That's our final question this morning. So I'd like to thank our guests for attending and returning, in fact, because obviously it was not too awful the first time round that you decided to come back. So thank you very much for your attendance and answering our questions this morning. It's very much appreciated. So we have some finishing up to do. You're very free to leave. Thank you very much. I was going to ask the committee to note the report and the discussion. And can we delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Excellent. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions from previous meetings of the committee? Noted. Good. Can I ask the committee to note our work programme and meeting dates? On which point, regarding date of next meeting, it's always very fixed at the end of a meeting when our next meeting is. This time it isn't. So the next meeting of the committee is provisionally scheduled for the 20th of February 2024 at 3 p.m. in the Chamber City Hall, but that is only penciled in at this stage, and we're in this uncertain budget process that we're going through. I have no urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.